successfully putting an end to these illegal acts. And make no mistake, this is an extraordinary and unprecedented measure which was invoked in the context of ongoing border blockades, and that became necessary after weeks of impasse with the occupation in Ottawa and after all other measures had been exhausted. It comes after occupiers have been directed to leave for weeks, after additional resources were provided to the police of local jurisdiction, and after coordinated efforts of law enforcement were not able to rectify the solution, nor move the illegal blockade in Ottawa. So this is not the first resort, and it has not been used lightly. But contrary to what many believe, it does not suspend the application of our rights and freedoms, and this act is replete with checks and balances to ensure it's not abused. This is an at most 30-day time-limited measure overseen by a committee of parliamentarians that is proportional, targeted, and which will be followed by an inquiry. It can also be revoked by Parliament at any time, and it is our duty to ensure that these powers are used prudently and only so long as they are needed. The measures being implemented allow the temporary designation of secure areas to prevent blockades, to allow for the freezing of accounts of those financing illegal activities and other assets used in furtherance of these illegal activities, to allow the RCMP to enforce local bylaws, to bring law enforcement capabilities from across the country to bear, and importantly, enable the government to commandeer tow trucks to finally move the blockade. And this is precisely what we've seen happen in the last week. And we've heard from the opposition that these powers are not necessary. So I want to quote the interim Ottawa police chief, who said on Friday, quote, "Without the authorities that have been provided to us through these pieces of legislation, we wouldn't be able to be doing the work we are today." End quote. I want to thank law enforcement for their professional work to carry out this operation largely safely, and for the vast majority of the protesters that eschewed violence and went home peacefully. And I also want to thank the media for putting themselves in harm's way to cover the events of the past few days in the face of so much abuse. And I've had constituents question whether there was, in fact, a public order emergency, as the Act requires to trigger this measure. So I want to touch on that briefly. The Emergencies Act states that the threshold that must be met is a reasonable belief a public order emergency exists. Public order emergencies are defined as serious threats to the security of Canada, and such threats are defined by the Canadian Security Intelligence Services Act as including foreign influence activities that are detrimental to the interest of Canada and are clandestine or deceptive or involve a threat to any person, the threat or use of acts of serious violence against persons or property for the purpose of achieving a political, religious, or ideological objective within Canada, and activities directed towards undermining by covert unlawful acts to lead to the destruction or overthrow by violence of the constitutionally established system of government in Canada. And we know that over half the donations made in furtherance of these illegal blockades came from international sources, the January 6th insurrection in Washington. And there have been serious threats and destructive acts to individuals and businesses in Ottawa, and the stated purpose of this enterprise was to overthrow the government. So from my reading, this threshold is clearly met. And many have raised concerns about the precedent that using this act presents. And while this act must always be used sparingly, I believe that it is warranted in the situation for the reasons I mentioned before. I would also counter that we need to be similarly concerned with the precedent that it would set if we did not act, the precedent that it would set if we allowed an openly seditious movement to be legitimized, as well as to legitimize the methods of blockading critical infrastructure, of seeking to hold cities hostages for weeks on end with the goal of forcing a change in government policy or of the government itself. And I would agree that we should not have ever ended up at this point. We should not have had to resort to the Emergencies Act, but here we are. And the last few weeks have revealed vulnerabilities in our law enforcement system, and it's incumbent upon us as parliamentarians to learn from these illegal blockades, who and what is behind them, to take remedial action that misinformation and foreign influence poses to our democracy. If we can do that, we will ensure the tools, systems, and protocols are in place to prevent similar situations from occurring without the need to invoke the Emergencies Act, as we must now. I also want to clarify distinction and misinterpretation that sits at the heart of these illegal activities, and that is the idea of freedom. Freedom cannot be absolute in a free and democratic society. Freedom is not a form of unbridled license to do whatever you want, regardless of how it harms others. personal freedoms must be limited when they take away the freedoms of others. The flip side of personal rights and freedoms are societal obligations and responsibilities. They must be balanced with the rights and freedoms of others. That is how a democratic society functions. And that's why these blockades must end. Political protest is protected by our charter right to freedom of expression, but there's no right in this country to block critical infrastructure, to harass fellow Canadians, to vandalize businesses and homes, to defecate in the streets, to saddle others with the cost of policing your actions, and to saddle our country with billions of dollars of economic losses from illegal blockades. None of these aforementioned acts can ever be considered a legitimate form of expression. And I have to say, I've been embarrassed with what I've seen in Canada over the last month. From the hateful symbols we've seen in public, to the hateful political rhetoric, to the horrible messages that I, my staff, and many of my honorable colleagues must have been receiving as well. We need to be civil. We need to be better. We need to be able to truly listen to the ideas that differ from our own without pointing fingers and calling each other names. As elected representatives of Canadians, that starts in this House. So with that, I look forward to the questions from my honorable friends.
Questions and comments. Question et commentaire. The honourable member for Calgary-Shepherd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So to ask a member the question, he said, that the point of all the protesters was to overthrow the government. But I've been closely following the Ottawa Police Service, and they're laying out charges against people that they detain and arrest. And so I've noticed that nobody has been charged with treason, sedition to commit, conspiracy to commit sedition, seditious intentions, riot. And I wonder if the member can please explain to me how it is that the government can claim something rhetorically and amp up the language in this chamber. We talk about civil debate when the charges being laid by police services, by prosecutors, does not match what the government is claiming these protests were about.
Honourable member for West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky Country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank my honourable colleague for his question. I don't want to comment on ongoing investigations right now, but what I will say is that the Freedom Convoy stated purpose was to do just that, was to overthrow the democratically elected government that we all are honored to sit in today. So I think those ideas and that intent was made very clear from the beginning, but I won't comment on the ongoing investigations that may be taking place right now.
In comments, question et commentaire. The honourable member for North Island, Powell River.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member who is also my neighbour for his intervention today. One of the things that I've heard during this time is that when we look outside and we see what has happened, when we talk about extremism, I've heard from some of these seats in this House, members say there's a few bad apples. And that's very concerning to me because we all know that there's a few bad apples in every group. The point is not the bad apples. It's the people who stand with the bad apples. If we look at our history on this planet, it is when people were quiet, when they minimized what was happening, that really terrible things were the outcome. So I'm just wondering if this member could speak to how important it is to stand against things that are extreme, that put us and our democracy in huge trouble, and make sure that we are not complicit. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member, West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky Country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I also want to thank my honourable neighbour, the member from North Island, Powell River, for her very important question. To the point to the member opposite the asked the previous question, certainly not all of those that are involved in these debates hold those views, but we need to be very careful that those views are not normalized within Canada, that seeing swastikas and to see Confederate flags is not normalized and kind of swept under the rug as just the acts of a few folks. We need to be very vigilant in this, and as I mentioned in my speech earlier, the real threat that could pose to our society if that becomes normalized. So I would completely agree with the comments and suggestions of my member.
Questions and comments. Question et commentaire. The Honourable l'Honourable Deputy de...
The Honourable Member for La Pointe-de-l'Île. I'd like to know, to ask my colleague, for him, what would it take for the emergency measures to be cancelled. Thank you.
Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky Country.
Merci, Monsieur le.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for the question. I certainly don't want to see these measures being used for a long time. In any case, the longest we can use them is 30 days, but we have already seen the impact of using them, both in downtown Ottawa and elsewhere in the country. And now investigations have begun. And we'll see how the Minister of Public Safety answers that question, because we don't need these measures if they're not absolutely necessary.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Kamloops, Thompson Caribou.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Always a pleasure to rise on behalf of the people of Kamloops, Thompson Caribou. And I take this member's remarks to be that the temperature really has to be dialed down in his view, that we have to really watch that things don't become normalized. So I'm wondering if he can comment, when it comes to normalizing things, on the Prime Minister's lack of apology to the member from Thornhill based on the comments he made in the House last week.
The Honourable Member for West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky Country, and a short answer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable colleague for his question. I think we all need to be very careful about what we say in this House and what we say in public. I mentioned in my speech, we don't want to be calling people names. We don't want to be pointing figures. And that's a responsibility that we all need to take to heart, and just to make sure that we're doing better, because we're setting an example for Canadians. We're here to represent Canadians, and so that's a responsibility and something that we need to take very seriously.
Reprise du débat, continuing debate. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When historians write this chapter of the Canadian story, what will they say about this protest? I don't question that for some, it was about vaccine requirements for truckers crossing the U.S.-Canada border. Nor do I question that others came here earnestly to protest pandemic restrictions and the disruption these public health measures brought on all of us. And although I do not share their views, vigorous debate and peaceful protest make Canada's democracy stronger. But for more than a few, Speaker, and for many of those of the core organizers themselves who sat atop a chain of command throughout this 3-week occupation, their purpose was something far more sinister, and one that betrayed the earnest initial intent of the others. These individuals came to upend the democracy upon which our country is found. They had their demands and soon resorted to intimidation, lawlessness, force, and even sedition to see them met, regardless of whether those demands were wise or whether they even fell within the jurisdiction of the federal government at all. So thwarted by the incoherence of their own demands and frustrated by our resolve, they laid siege to our capital with the stated intent to overthrow the democratically elected government and install themselves in our place. Today, it is evident that they have failed. With the powers of the Emergencies Act, law and order has returned to the streets of Ottawa. Our democratic system and the rights and freedoms that it carries on. Members of Parliament, duly elected, continue debate on the Emergencies Act invoked in the spirit of peace, order, and good government. Today, it is evident this measure was necessary. So, Mr. Speaker, let me speak to why I will be voting in support of invoking the Emergencies Act. I have the benefit of addressing the chamber following this week's police operation that finally brought the occupation to its end. And what we saw was a methodical, orderly, restrained operation by professional police from across the country working as one. And we know now just how integral the powers of the Emergencies Act were to the success of that operation. When asked if the Emergency Act was necessary, the interim chief of the Ottawa Police, Steve Bell, could not have been more clear. Police could not have done the job they did, the way they did it, without the powers provided by the Act. That comes from the senior commanding officer for the operation, and he's not alone. Many more academic, legal, and security professionals have come to the same conclusion, including Harper-appointed Senator Vernon White, a former Ottawa Police chief himself, and security expert Wesley Work, a senior fellow at the Centre for International Governance, who I know to be a respected voice by many in this chamber, including my Conservative colleagues. And it's of course worth noting that a recent poll indicated that 2/3 of Canadians support this measure as well. Now, specifically, the Emergencies Act provided these key powers that were absolutely critical. One, it allowed police to establish a secure perimeter around the downtown core, preventing additional trucks or groups from joining the occupations. Two, it allowed Canadian financial service providers to immediately freeze or suspend accounts of an individual or a business affiliated with these illegal blockades until such time as that illegal activity was ceased. Three, it compelled private companies to provide towing services, fully compensated, to remove trucks and other vehicles from the occupation zone. Now, it also allowed for the RCMP to enforce municipal bylaws, among other important measures. So some have asked, as is responsible, if the Emergencies Act is an overreach. In fact, that is the essential question before Parliament today, and it's a minority Parliament that will make a determination on the matter and revoke the measure if it is not agreed to by the House, an excellent example of the oversight built into the legislation written by the Mulroney government. With due credit to the Progressive Conservative Party at that time, other accountability measures include a special joint committee of both the House of Commons and the Senate to review the government's actions under the Act on an ongoing basis, a 30-day sunset to make sure that these powers don't extend longer than necessary, and an inquiry after 1 year. Importantly, Mr. Speaker, the Emergencies Act does not limit charter rights. Rather, it is subordinate to those rights. Still, a common refrain from the occupiers is that the Emergencies Act and the police operation to end the lawlessness in our capital trampled on their charter rights to peaceful assembly. That is simply false. The charter protections extend only to assembly that is peaceful. Seriously disturb the peace as the occupation of Ottawa has done over the past 3 weeks. And it does not provide cover for illegal activities carried out during a protest, like the flagrant disregard for the law that has been well documented in the streets of our capital throughout the occupation. Hate crimes, misogyny, arson, vandalism, intimidation, the list is long. And importantly, the Emergencies Act is democratic. It's an act of Parliament, already debated and passed by both houses, given royal assent, proclaimed and gazetted some 30 years ago. And now its application is being democratically debated in the House of Commons. So, did the time-limited, targeted, and proportionate powers of the Act work? Well, for the first time in 23 days, quiet has descended upon Ottawa. The streets of this city have finally been returned to its residents, law and order has been restored, and the Emergencies Act has performed its function as intended by the Progressive Conservative government that enacted it in 1988. But now, 3 decades later, we find ourselves in an unexpected situation in which the party of Mulroney opposes invoking the measure while the Liberals and the NDP support it. Our parliamentary system requires Her Majesty's loyal opposition, Mr. Speaker. It's an essential part of the checks and balances that keep our country stable, on stable footing, and ensures diverse voices of Canadians are heard in this place. Yet when crisis strikes, as leaders, we are called to rise above our political divides, for we all take an oath as members of Parliament to act in the best interests of our country. Sadly, that is not what we have seen from the Conservatives throughout this occupation. Through their actions in the last 3 weeks, it is all too clear that the Conservative Party has strayed from its origins as a party of principle and accountability. Their proud tradition as the party of law and order lies shattered in the dirty snow of Wellington Street. Through their actions in the last 3 weeks, it's all too clear that the Conservative Party has strayed from its origins as a party of principle and accountability. They've put their own political gain ahead of the country's security, prosperity, and democracy. And as their party clamors for an ever smaller and more extreme faction of the far right, they abandon the hard-working, small-c Conservatives who look to them for a credible potential government. Instead, the Canadians they've left behind watch in horror as our police and media are spat on and assaulted in the throes of a lawless occupation that today's Conservative Party has chosen to defend.
Shameful.
Mr. Speaker, with the help of the powers of the Emergencies Act, the occupation has come to its end, the trucks and the protesters have gone home, the people of Ottawa breathe a sigh of relief, and Parliament resumes its important democratic function. And yet something has changed in Canada, or has perhaps been uncovered these past 3 weeks. Some will say a divide has grown wider. Political columnist John Ivison wrote yesterday that it feels like Canada is splintering into 2 tribes, the intolerant, authoritarian, woke lunatics on the left and the spittle-flecked, hateful lunatics of the far right. The optimist in me wants to deny it, but I cannot. At times, that is how it feels. And perhaps that's how it feels to a growing number of Canadians as well after these last 2 years, or perhaps after these last 23 days. So we need to log out of social media, put down our phones, stop doom scrolling, and ask why. Why is it that despite pretty strong consensus on the effectiveness of the broad pandemic response from all parties and all orders of government, it still feels at times like we're more divided than ever? The answer may lie in the palm of our hands, the devices we carry with us day and night. Our political beliefs and grievances are being fed to us by opaque algorithms that serve a singular function: profit for the massive tech giants that dominate our online realm. These platforms prey on our psyche, weaponizing our emotions to keep us all online all the time, garnering untold fortunes in ad revenue. Disinformation, a tool of foreign influence in the cyber era, goes unchecked. Division, it turns out, is a moneymaker. And so the scene was set. As a pandemic locked us inside, the very same screens they told us that would keep us together served instead to push us further apart. It's my hope that the Joint Committee and Inquiry required in the Emergencies Act will take a hard look at the fundamental role of online platforms and what they played in stoking the flames of division, of anger, and disinformation, making it harder and harder for any of us to see the other side, as though we lived in two entirely different separate universes, unrecognizable to one another, with the incompatible ideas of truth, media, and science. Until we address this, Mr. Speaker, I fear we risk repeating the crisis in who knows what terrifying form next time. And so we must act before a generation of children, our children, online as they are, grow up never knowing that there was a better way to be. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question and commentaire. The Honourable Member for Kamloops Thompson Caribou.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Always a pleasure to rise on behalf of the people of Kamloops Thompson Caribou. I find it rather disheartening, Mr. Speaker, that we have an ode to hope here, and yet we have such partisan rhetoric that really couches this ode to hope. Now, one of the things that the Honourable Member said in his speech was that public opinion was on his side. So I'd like to ask this Honourable Member, when did the rule of law become subordinate to public opinion? Because he cited those two principles, and sometimes they're incompatible. So if the rule of law is superlative, why is he not abiding by the rule of law?
The Honourable Member for Halifax.
I can't discern a sensible question there, but the member did mention political rhetoric, and I note that the party's interim leader, the member's interim leader, stated recently that MPs need to return to the House to restore unity, wholeness, and hope back to our nation. And I just suggest to the member that perhaps he and his interim leader should focus on restoring unity, wholeness, and hope back to their party as we watch it self-immolate in real time, day by day.
That's right.
Question and commentaire. L'honorable député Lapp.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member.
Pour faire des actions qui font intervenir plus.
Yes. In order to have actions, why not just use the police services? We do not require emergency measures. Why didn't we resort to police services under existing law more quickly?
I thank the member for the question. It's an important one. Of course, as I mentioned in my remarks, that the interim chief of police here in Ottawa was very clear in stating that he was unable to do his job without the Act. We have seen the Canadian Association of Police Chiefs underscore that same truth, that this Act was a required action to have been taken by the government to help police forces across the country to deal with blockades. I would go further to say that the checks built into this Act, the review and panel, the special committee that will be set up to review the actions under the Act will give more light on the question that the member asks. But for now, I'm very satisfied that we're well within the confines of the law, sir, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question and commentaire. The Honourable Member for Port Moody Coquitlam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the passionate speech, but I do have to ask, with the urgency I'm hearing today, why it took the Prime Minister so long to take this seriously.
The Honourable Member for Halifax.
Well, I remind the member that multiple premiers across the country reached out and asked for help, and when that happened, that is when the government got busy invoking the act. Now, it was very important to give the provincial governments their required time and space to act under their own laws and rules, but when it became clear to some of those premiers and to the federal government that the additional powers of the act were required, the Prime Minister and the Cabinet acted very swiftly, and the results, as we saw, were delivered very swiftly as well.
Question commentaire, questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the member's comments. And when I think in terms of the impact that it's had on people in our communities and jobs, whether it's in Alberta, Manitoba, and Ontario in particular, where we saw blockades preventing $500 million of trade between two countries. And as I say, it had a horrendous impact, shutting down Ottawa, all through illegal blockades. And we had requests from the province of Alberta and the province of Manitoba writing to the Prime Minister or to the Government of Canada asking for support. And this is one of the tools that we have provided, and it has been effective. And I'm wondering if he could just provide his thoughts in terms of the importance of the tool.
Secrétaire parlementaire au ministre de l'Innovation, Sciences et l'Industrie.
I thank my friend for the important question, and I think we all have stories about how the lockdown here and the blockades elsewhere have had a personal impact. But I'm going to address the part of your question about trade and the interruption of trade and the job loss and the shuttering of automobile factories in Canada and the loss of wages that resulted from these blockades. I was privileged to be part of a call 2 days ago with the Canada-America Business Council, where I found it necessary to reassure our Canadian or American trade partners that the government has acted at a national level to ensure that such disruptions won't happen again. And it was important for them to hear that, and they are edified by that. We must never let it happen again. Thank you.
Reprise du débat, continuing debate. The Honourable Member for Northumberland, Peterborough South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it is with heavy heart that I rise today. This is a solemn day that will no doubt be remembered in the minds and memories of Canadians for decades to come. Given the gravity of today's debate, I believe it is incumbent on all members to speak candidly, earnestly, and sincerely. Today, we are, of course, debating the Emergency Measures Act, but before we outline why the invocation of this act is capricious and completely unnecessary, I think it is best to provide some context to how our country got to where we are right now. It is truly clear, unfortunately, that Canada is that's facing significant economic problems that put our entire prosperity at risk. Our economy has just experienced significant job loss. We are experiencing an inflation crisis, inflation at a 30-year high at 5.1%, and that has real consequences, Mr. Speaker. There are people, many Canadians out there, who can't afford the bare necessities of life. We have over $1 trillion in debt that will doubtlessly be pushed on to future generations as they pay for our expenditures. Our country, as I said, is divided. It is divided between West versus East, rural versus urban, freedom versus security, vaccinated versus unvaccinated. And now, our Prime Minister has invoked the Emergency Measures Act, an act that suspends the civil liberties of Canadians, such as Section 2 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, including the right to freedom of assembly, the right of freedom of association, and Section 8, the freedom from unreasonable search and seizure. The police can literally, without warrant or warning, seize your property. They can arrest Canadians for simply assembling together. Never in my life, in my wildest dreams, Mr. Speaker, did I ever expect to have 5 police checks just to get to my office. Never did I ever expect that in Canada. The invocation of the Emergency Measures Act has also given the government the right to freeze bank accounts without judicial oversight. This can create financial ruins, putting an asterisk beside someone's financial credit rating for life. This might be a mortgage that never happens, a son or a daughter that never goes to university because of this asterisk. And why was this? Well, according to the Minister of Justice, who said when talking to the media, for the grounds could be as little as supporting causes the government disagrees with. This is shameful, Mr. Speaker. Shameful. Because when you freeze someone's bank account, You are removing them effectively from society. They may not have money to pay for food to feed their children, to pay for gasoline to put in their car to go to work, to pay for electricity to heat their homes. The government may literally starve and freeze Canadians away into submission. I watched this weekend as protesters were arrested at gunpoint. They were pepper sprayed. Several protesters were trampled by 2,000-pound horses. How could the Prime Minister ever let the situation get this bad? This is not our Canada, Mr. Speaker. So let's go back. What led us to these circumstances? Well, I think it makes sense to start with a change in tone from the Prime Minister heading into his unnecessary $600 million election. The Prime Minister, based no doubt on polling numbers, made a calculated effort to demonize unvaccinated Canadians, to capitalize on a growing frustration of vaccinated Canadians with the unvaccinated. The choice led the Prime Minister to demean and stigmatize, as the member from Louis-Hébert so eloquently said. The Prime Minister said, they are extremists who do not believe in science. They are often misogynist, often racist. It's a small group that muscles in. And we have to make a decision in terms of leaders, in terms of country. Do we tolerate these people? Mr. Speaker, that is repugnant. And I have sat here and listened to liberal member after one saying we need to de-escalate, we need to bring down the heat. We'll start by talking to the Prime Minister. Also, it was no doubt as part of the Prime Minister's strategy to demonize and to exploit cleavages between our society that he decided to implement a 14-day quarantine period on our truckers, our heroes, who throughout COVID for 2 years, when there were no vaccines, they went across, they braved the Delta variant, they braved the Omicron variant, and they were our heroes, and now they are demonized. And yet, all we've asked, all the media has asked for, all the opposition members have asked for, is for the government to show us their math. Instead, we get outdated, irrelevant talking points. So we have cost thousands of Canadians their livelihood for purely partisan politics. This is disgusting. Even when presented with the most utterly reasonable motion, our party simply asked for a plan, just a plan to end the mandate. The Prime Minister remained defiant, refusing to support the plan. While the rest of the world opens up their borders, while the rest of the world eases restrictions, our Prime Minister will not even give the Canadians who deserve hope a plan for that hope, a plan to return to normality. Once again, this Prime Minister has chosen politics over science, petulance over leadership. This crisis could have been avoided with strong, compassionate leadership. Instead, this Prime Minister chose partisanship over statesmanship, division over unity, and this has led us to the current crisis. The Prime Minister's unnecessary mandate and divisive rhetoric has caused frustrations to boil over. Canadians from across the country began to spontaneously demonstrate and show their dissatisfaction with the Liberal government. Unfortunately, some of the movement splintered into illegal activities, including the blockades of the border crossings at Coots and the Ambassador Bridge. Fortunately, the provinces were able to resolve these matters peacefully, and they ended with hugs instead of violence. Here in Ottawa, while many of the protesters were salt of the earth Canadians who wanted to express their grievances, unfortunately, there were some who expressed hate, and they should all be individually accountable for those expressions. In addition, there were approximately 150 vehicles who were parked in Parliament for over 3 weeks. These vehicles disrupted lives. They made it impossible for individuals to go to school, to go to work, and they needed to be moved, and that cannot be doubted. To end this, though, the Prime Minister overreached. He invoked the Emergency Measures Act. The Emergency Measures Act is fairly clear and fairly prescriptive. It requires that 3 tests will be met. One, that the public disorder created a threat to the security of Canada. Secondly, that it was national in scope. And third, that the public disorder could not be resolved by other means. Let's review these criteria one by one. Was there a security threat to Canada? A security threat would presumably be something extremely significant. A clear example would be a potential use of a nuclear or chemical weapon. Those are security threats to Canada. Or a paramilitary force threatening to overthrow Canada, the Canadian government. What we had here were 150 illegally parked vehicles and a mass of disorganized people, some of them who had repugnant views, including the overthrow of the government. But there is no actionable intelligence that I have seen or any evidence that there was actually the ability to threaten our government. I walked through there for 3 weeks. And if, in fact, this government allowed all MPs to walk through these protests and there was an imminent threat to our government, this is the most malfeasance that a security or a government has ever had. Second, it's national in scope. And maybe 3 weeks ago, we might have had an argument about this. When Coots and the Ambassador Bridge blockades were happening, we might have had an argument. But they're gone. And you know what? So is the protest in Ottawa. Why has this not been revoked by now? Where is the threat? Where is it? It's clear. It's done. The other thing is that it cannot be resolved by other legislation. Clearly, it could and it has been, both at the Ambassador Bridge and otherwise. It is true that it would be helpful, but a sledgehammer would be helpful to crack a walnut, but it wouldn't be necessary, and that's the case here. Ultimately, this is not about truckers or one's vaccination status. This is about the future of Canada. Do we want a country that is free to dissent? Because a government that controls discourse controls our lives. Do we want a country where environmentalists who fear that we're not doing enough on climate change? Do we want a country where Quebecers can share their requests for greater autonomy? Do we want a government where a conservative can share his contempt for the government? Because I believe all of these voices should be heard.
Question et commentaires, questions and comments. The honourable member for Vancouver Granville.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank the member opposite for his impassioned speech. I have to admit I'm struck by much of what he said. And in the spirit of thinking through sort of fact, he mentioned that many people were trampled. 2 people were trampled. And then you look at the news reports who say that the reporter actually admitted that that there was in fact no trampling. So I just want to make sure that we clarify the facts in this House. Now, I would ask the following question, Mr. Speaker. The other side does not trust the government. Would they trust the National Security Advisor to Stephen Harper and the former Director of CSIS, Richard Fadden, who said that the government was in a position to, and that it was appropriate to invoke the Emergencies Act, particularly as it related to the federal banking measures, which were not covered under other legislation?
The honourable member from Northumberland, Peterborough South.
Thank you, and I'll be kind and generous and just say that the individual misheard. I clearly said 2, and if you check the records, you will. And if you want to watch the video, it's available. So that's just watch it. It's on film. There's 2 individuals, including one lady who's in a scooter or walker who gets trampled by a 2,000-pound horse. I have horses. Let me tell you, that's going to hurt a whole lot, and that happened. So you can shake your head all you want. Look at the video. Secondly, I went through it blow by blow by blow. There is not a national security threat that cannot be resolved by other legislation. It is clear. I don't know how others say that.
I just want to remind when we're answering questions to come through the chair and make sure we not take this so personally. I know it's been late in the day and we all have still lots to say and lots to comment and question.
The honourable member for Jonquière. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In his speech, my colleague said that the government had put political interests and partisanship before science. He said that by referring to the motion that the Conservatives tabled with regard to what Dr. Tam said, but I heard a number of Conservative colleagues said that vaccination was a bit of a problem, whereas science tells us to get vaccinated. So perhaps my colleague can respond quickly. Is he pro-vaccination? Does he agree that the best way to emerge from this crisis is by getting vaccinated? I'd like to hear what he has to say on that.
Peterborough South.
Thank you very much. And I'm sorry for, it must be the end of the day. I'm a little passionate there. So my apologies to the member there if I got a little passionate. I am definitely pro-vaccine. I am proudly vaxxed, and I believe everyone should be vaccinated. However, we also need to give, we need to not demonize people who think differently than us. We live in a free country, and when we demonize, when we call people misogynists, when we call them racist, that is not Canadian. That is not our Canada.
Commentaire, the honourable member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would like to thank my colleague for his intervention in the House. I've worked closely with him on the direction and control bill that I know he brought forward, and I'm quite pleased with some of the work that he's done in this House. One of the questions that I have for him, though, as we look for solutions to the crisis that is facing Canadians, is how we deal with foreign funding or illegal funding of domestic terrorist groups. And I'm just wondering whether or not he would support urgent legislation being put in place to prevent domestic terrorist groups from being funded.
The honourable member for Northumberland, Peterborough South.
I thank the honourable member for her comment, and I've enjoyed working with her in S216, and if I'm not being too bold, enjoyed walking with her to the House earlier. But what I would say is this is an area of study, and it is an area where we need to look at these new technologies. Unfortunately, our government's been behind on many things, including reviewing how cryptocurrency works in our context. We need to look at crowdfunding. We need to review all of these topics.
Continuing debate, the honourable member for Kootenay, Columbia.
Good job. Mr. Speaker, the government has cited a public order emergency throughout Canada as their justification to invoke the Emergencies Act. They're wrong. In this chamber, the Prime Minister said he invoked the Emergencies Act because the situation could not be dealt with under any other law in Canada. That is false. The leader of the NDP talks about tools available should the government abuse the power provided within this act, but he's missed a critical point. The abuse has already happened. Neither of them are listening to Canadians and are instead choosing a path of divisive policies, distinctively separate from democracy and the voice of Canadians. Mr. Speaker, the freedom is the heart of democracy, and the right to choose is at the heart of freedom. Let me say that again. The right to choose is at the heart of freedom. And freedom is what so many hundreds of thousands of Canadian women and men have paid the ultimate sacrifice to defend. A Métis man in my riding of Kootenay, Columbia wrote me this week to tell me a story of his family's commitment to preserving and securing democracy and his concern about the current government actions. He told me the story of his great-grandfather, who was wounded in the First World War. He holds tightly as a reminder of how he came to be free, that very bullet that tore through his great-grandfather's leg. He also told me a story that his grandfather fought in the Canadian 1st Infantry Division that made its way through Italy, Ortona, to stop Hitler's advances to Europe. These are but two examples of hundreds of thousands of Canadians who have sacrificed for our freedoms, the very freedoms this government has restricted. Why did the Prime Minister go directly to invoking the Emergencies Act? He had numerous opportunities to address this situation peacefully over the past few weeks, and yet chose to do nothing. I can think of 4 reasonable actions that would have allowed us to avoid the difficulties we'd faced. The Prime Minister could have sent a delegation. The Prime Minister could have sent the Public Safety Minister or the Emergency Preparedness Minister. The Prime Minister could have met with opposition leaders like the Conservative leader requested. And finally, the Prime Minister could have met and listened to these Canadians himself. And of course, the government could have removed COVID restriction vaccine passports at our border crossings and airports. But we know, Mr. Speaker, that listening, the one thing that would have helped de-escalate, is the very thing he did not do. Having a significant background in law enforcement, the basic rule of law is to listen to the concerns and work towards a peaceful resolution, not to enter into a fight first. I can't imagine if every police officer went to a call and didn't listen to the issues first. Dialogue is significantly more productive than the Emergency Act. Instead, what he decided to do was further ratchet up, escalate, and divide Canadians with hurtful rhetoric, Well, Mr. Speaker, Canadians aren't buying divisive rhetoric. The Prime Minister no longer has footing rooted in democracy, and all members of this House have a simple choice to make. Do you side with freedom of the institutions of democracy, or do you side with the Prime Minister and the leader of the NDP, who want to seize bank accounts of Canadians with whom they disagree? Apparently, accounts have already been frozen, so this sets a precedent that all illegal road, logging sites, pipeline blockades, railroad blockades, the future funding is subject to this process. Back to the Emergency Act, I choose freedom. Let us not be so foolish as to water down the significance of this movement and our obligations to those we serve and the impacts this will have on generations that follow. The decisions we make in this chamber on this issue will reverberate through the walls of history, and we will be held to account. The choice is simple. Protect and defend democracy or tear it down. I, Mr. Speaker, will be voting to defend it. We must not accept a situation where it's up to a Prime Minister or any member of the government to decide, outside the laws created in this chamber, which protests are legal and which are not. We surely must not tolerate a scenario where families are separated because of their ideas or beliefs and are different than that of the Prime Ministers or the government of the day. Mr. Speaker, Kootenay Columbians see this as being about a Prime Minister's ego, about lack of leadership and weakening precedents. Mr. Speaker, through you, I'd like to take this moment to speak to those members of the Liberal caucus who are feeling uneasy about being whipped to a vote they know to be wrong. Your country needs you to uphold the values of democracy and freedom. Our country will be strong and free long after we leave this place, and it is our responsibility to ensure it is so. The Emergency Act was not invoked during the fears and protests around the Spanish flu that took 50 million lives around the world. It was not invoked during the Great Depression and the worker strikes in the 30s. It was not invoked during the crisis of Oka or Ipperwash, and it was not invoked in the aftermath of 9/11. During my time in law enforcement in British Columbia, it was not invoked to solve the riots in Penticton and Kelowna where downtown storefronts were destroyed. And it was not invoked to address a month-long illegal standoff at Gussison Lake, one of the largest in the history of the province. There were RCMP members shot, helicopters taking rifle fire, landowners unable to go home. I was at this event and can say with certainty, it was much like a war zone. In British Columbia, Canada, no Emergency Act. And currently there is an illegal blockade and protest at the Coastal GasLink drill site on the Martin Forestry Road near Houston, BC. On February 17th, there was an attack on a number of CGL employees and RCMP, and a member physically injured in the attack. Initial damage to equipment and buildings is estimated over $10 million. RCMP are investigating mischief, assault, criminal harassment, and man-trap set purposely to injure police. Now, this appears to be a violent, illegal action that the Emergency Act would support law enforcement, especially also given the financial support, GoFundMe.com, has financing from outside Canada. Where the other methods and authorities exist to deal with disagreement, government should use these methods and authorities. Government should not subject free people to abuse of wide-ranging, freedom-altering overreach. I stand before you today on behalf of the people I represent, the thousands of phone calls and emails from individuals concerned about their Charter of Rights and Freedom. I stand in this chamber, Mr. Speaker, after a lifetime of experience within the RCMP to explain to the Prime Minister and his colleagues in this House he is wrong in his actions. Police agencies have the tools they need, but it does start with dialogue. The government had numerous other legislative options it could have considered before going to the extreme of invoking the Emergency Act. The Act makes it clear it's only meant to address urgent and critical situations that cannot effectively be dealt with under any other law in Canada. The government wants the public to believe otherwise, but in fact, they do have the power to direct the RCMP under Section 5 of the RCMP Act. The government did nothing for weeks and are now taking unprecedented steps that are not necessary. Regardless of the talking points being used by the government and what they would like Canadians to believe, the fact remains the Prime Minister's actions represents real limits on our charter rights. Mr. Speaker, civil liberties, the rule of law, democratic norms, these are all principles that require constant vigilance to defend. The measures under the Emergency Act raise serious questions with respect to the rights of Canadians. Section 2 guarantees our freedom of association and assembly. Section 7 guarantees our right to life, liberty, and security of a person, and Section 8 guarantees our protection against unreasonable search and seizure. How and why Canadians be assured this government is protecting our rights with this extraordinarily and unprecedented invoking of the Emergencies Act. The following organizations have also now come out publicly against the Prime Minister's overreach: the World Sikh Organization of Canada, BC Civil Liberties Association, the Canadian Constitution Federation. This is in addition to opposition from governments Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, Quebec, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta. So, who wholeheartedly agrees with the Prime Minister and the Liberals, Mr. Speaker? The NDP, that's who. 25 votes in this 338-vote House separate the will of Canadians from democracy. And as much as Canadians learn about the Emergencies Act and the NDP support of it, they are sounding alarm bells. The silent majority is awake. Canadians are watching and will not forget the decision we make in this chamber on this issue. Freedom will prevail on Friday, or will prevail when this government fails. But make no mistake, freedom will prevail. However, the current leader of the NDP is supporting the Prime Minister at any cost. We arrive at this unfortunate moment as the direct result of failed leadership by the Prime Minister and his government. Mr. Speaker, I employ all colleagues to take note. Future generations will read and learn about their actions and their support and abuse of power. It will be recorded in history, written in textbooks, and taught in classrooms. This wayward principle has lost control long ago. Opposition to the NDP, supported by Liberal overreach, is growing. Invoking the Emergency Act is clear government overreach, and the Conservatives will oppose it. I just want to add, I really appreciate the thousands of individuals, including Columbia, who have reached out to me, hoping common sense prevails. It is so difficult to understand why the federal government, when so many provinces have eliminated most COVID restrictions, for example, I was in Calgary and there was no vaccine passport, so why does the federal government continue with vaccine restrictions and federal regulated locations, border crossings, airports? We would not be here if common sense and following science our provincial partners are doing. I do hope the government starts to listen. We need Canada united and proud. It is time.
Question commentaire, questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Halifax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I haven't had the pleasure of meeting the member yet, but I look forward to meeting him and working with him productively in the House. And I thank him for his invitation to vote against the motion confirming the declaration of emergency, but I must assure him that I'll be voting in favor of it. And I must also remind him that, in fact, 2/3 of Canadians support it, including 75% of Canadians in his own province of British Columbia, 72% of Canadians in Quebec, in the Atlantic provinces, 65% in Ontario, 57% in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and 51% in Alberta. In fact, a majority of Canadians in every province support the invocation. And by the way, 82% of Canadians believe that premiers who lifted restrictions lifted them too quickly. 82% of Canadians. But my question is the following for the member. You mentioned you wish that the Prime Minister, one of your actions he could have taken, you wish that he had spoken to the protesters. And I remember a press conference in the early days of the protest, and it looked like it was a small confined basement room somewhere. The Conservatives were asking the Prime Minister to speak with this group. My question is, why would the Prime Minister of any country empower illegal occupiers with a conversation, and what message would that send to future occupiers? Thank you.
Kootenai, Columbia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yeah, the question I think really is, why didn't the Prime Minister or members of the government go talk? I almost said go talk to the individuals that were here that were organizing those events and see what they actually wanted, what they were going to do, rather than sit in here and do nothing. I didn't say whether the Prime Minister. I said that's an option he had, but they also could have sent Public Safety Minister, could have sent the Emergency Preparedness Minister, could have just opened dialogue, and that is what is missing here. There's no dialogue. Thank you.
Question et commentaire, l'honorable député de Jonquière.
The Honourable Member for Jonquière. Well, ultimately, I do not want to tease my colleague, but I find it quite surprising that over the last few days, we've actually been quite close to the Conservative Party on this matter. And I wonder if they're going to start following the right path, because if I think about women's right to make decisions about their body, if you think about medical assistance in dying or conversion therapy, well, the Conservatives weren't so adamant on the topic of freedoms. So are we seeing a renewal of this spirit among the Conservatives? Perhaps the NDP is turning to the Conservatives?
Depends, but but on a serious note, I've always been that way for rights and freedoms, so that's where I've been, and since I've been elected, that's where I'll stand.
Questions and comments? Question and commentaire. The honourable member for Vancouver East.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for his comments. You know, one of the issues that he did not touch on was, of course, the impact of this illegal occupation for the residents. And it took a private citizen to bring the matter to court. And in fact, she also was reported in the media that she was threatened and attacked. So I wonder if the members have any comments for the residents who suffer through all of this, who receive threats and harassments, what his comments are. Do they not have rights, and should their safety not be protected?
The honourable member for Kootenay, Columbia.
I want to thank the member for the question. It's really up to the police to respond to those issues, and could have responded. I believe that they've already talked with the government and they responded as they felt appropriate. Thank you.
Question commentaire. Time for a quick question here, if anybody's interested. The honourable member for Brampton South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Premier, Mayor support this Emergency Act. The local police support the use of Emergency Act. I would like to ask my colleague why he don't think this is necessary when the people's lives have been impacted, business supply has been impacted, why he don't think it's important.
The honourable member for Kootenay, Columbia.
Well, I never said it wasn't important. But there's been, for example, just before COVID, we had the railway blockade, Mr. Speaker, where $6 billion were lost to our economy, and we didn't react to that. So I think when you ask the question of, I do care, and I think we should be doing something, and I do believe we do not need the Emergency Act to keep our streets safe.
Reprise du débat, continuing debate. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, l'Honourable Secrétaire parlementaire de la ministre de Santé mentale et les dépendances.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Mr. Speaker, I'll be sharing my time with my honourable colleague of Newmarket, Aurora. Monsieur le Président, le droit à la manifestation est un droit fondamental.
Mr. Speaker, the right to protest is a fundamental right in our country. And this right has been used many times in Canada for causes that have made our society progress. For example, women's rights, the end of racial segregation, LGBTQ2+ rights, reconciliation with First Nations, Métis and Inuit communities. But now, we're seeing this right to protest being derailed by far-right populist movements, which is undermining the general interests of the Canadian public, public order, democracy, the parliamentary process, and elected officials' right to represent Canadians. This is very concerning. As various media sources have shown from the very beginning of what became an occupation of Parliament Hill, conspiracy and hate symbols were unabashedly flown by the protesters in the downtown area over the last 3 weeks. The use of these symbols reminds us that freedom of expression does not mean that one can spread hate. Yet the people promoting this movement do not seem to have realized that, right up until today. As we speak, downtown Ottawa has been evacuated, but the protesters are moving to new rallying spots. The pandemic has been and is still one of the greatest challenges that many Canadians have ever faced. The challenges have been different for each of us, but the great majority of us have faced the difficulties and have understood the importance of respecting the measures implemented by provincial and federal governments. We are all overwhelmed by this pandemic, which has been going on and on for nearly 2 years. We have all made sacrifices. We have sacrificed for our families, our friends, our communities, and the most vulnerable. Canadians' mental health has been seriously affected by the pandemic, which means that there is an increase in stress, anxiety, overuse of substances, and violence. It is clearly time to be done with this darn virus. But unfortunately, this virus is very stubborn. Last week, the official opposition was talking about Denmark as an example of lifting health restrictions. And yet recently, Denmark saw cases of COVID skyrocket, and so did the number of deaths. Which is why we need to do things right for all of us, for our health workers, for our economy, and for our business owners who do not want to see more lockdowns. And the fact that a loud minority has an ideological opposition to health measures while being encouraged by foreign influences does not mean that we should tolerate harassment. It does not mean people can bully the inhabitants of Ottawa, causing seniors to be scared and not be able to go out to get groceries. It does not mean that people can remove pedestrians' masks by force and also oblige business owners to continue the lockdown longer. And in fact, this occupation even reduced public order by overwhelming 911, which meant that Ottawa residents' right to safety and security was taken hostage. And of course, there were also heavy economic consequences and signs of foreign interference in orchestrating this illegal protest. I would like to remind us that this pandemic is unfortunately not over, that the virus is the real enemy, and the best way to overcome it is to get vaccinated, follow science, and work together, as we have been doing from the beginning, instead of encouraging people who wish to sow division. For 2 years, our government has implemented unprecedented financial assistance. This has helped to support Canadians, our businesses and organizations, to help them get through this difficult time. But because of the occupation of Ottawa and elsewhere in Canada, some businesses have had to stay closed. People have lost their jobs. All sectors are affected. And the harm to our economy totals millions of dollars. It would be really regrettable if the efforts made by the government to fight the consequences of COVID-19, it would be really regrettable if they ultimately disappeared due to the actions of a group of protesters who wish to undermine the democratic process in this House. When I was in university, our professors were constantly telling us that what legislators do has real effects. The Emergencies Act, which was sponsored by a Conservative minister, was adopted in order to be used. It's a good thing that it didn't have to be used over the last 34 years. Canada is a peaceful country, and the Canadians are extremely resilient. There is an entire process to implement this act, consulting the provinces and territories, hours of debate, a vote, and analysis by a committee.
Elle protège le droit de manifester.
It is quite different from the War Measures Act. It protects many rights. This is not a decision taken lightly, and it is not the decision of one single person. Before the decision was made, there were calls, consultations, meetings with the Mayor of Ottawa, with the Ottawa Police, with the premiers of the provinces and territories. Over the last few weeks, we have felt a shift. Over the last few weeks, we have felt the rise of something that is not like us. This emergencies legislation gives the necessary tools to those who are on the ground, who are living with the situation head-on, face-to-face with the nastiness, the confrontation, and the defamation. It allows the government to mobilize its essential services and allows the RCMP to act more quickly, to have local regulations complied with, to stop money from circulating. These are targeted and temporary measures. The acting chief of police, in fact, said that this weekend's operation could not have taken place without the powers of the law. The best example is the towing companies. When first requested by Ottawa Police, they would not come and tow the parked trucks. Under the Emergencies Act, they had to comply with the Ottawa Police requests and participate in the dismantling operation. And we thank them very much for that. We were quite patient. Reasonable and proportionate measures were taken in cooperation with the provinces and territories to dismantle the occupation and unblock the economy. We are sending a clear message to protect our democracy, to protect everyone's safety, and reinstate confidence in our institutions. At 6 p.m. this evening, the acting chief of police in Ottawa, said that despite the successful operations of the last few days, our city is not in its normal state, and that police measures must be maintained to avoid the return of the protesters. Madam Speaker, we respect the right to protest and the rule of law, but we condemn violence and lawlessness. They protested. We heard them. Now it is time for them to leave downtown Ottawa. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Comments, the honourable member for Calgary-Shepherd.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. What I would say to begin with is that perhaps they heard them, but they didn't listen to them. I think it is important to admit that the government did not listen to the protesters who came here and elsewhere, which they did very energetically, that is true. Now, I would like to ask the honourable member a question. In the private sector, when people have consultations, it's to either to convince the other people that that you're right, or that you want to present arguments that you hope that will make sense to them. When the Emergencies Act, in the Emergencies Act, it says that the government has to consult provinces. How can it be that if the government did consult the premiers of the various provinces, that 7 out of 10 premiers, following the consultation, left the meeting and said explicitly that they did not want the Emergencies Act to be used in our country? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my colleague for his question, and I also thank him for having asked it in French, and I congratulate him for that too. You know, Canada is a large country. Situations vary from one place to the next, and the Emergencies Act contains a rigorous process, as I said in my speech, for its own implementation. And that process does indeed include consultations, and those consultations did take place. Another advantage of the Act is that it applies to the demand. That is to say, it would be applied where there was a need to do that. So some provinces do wish the law to be applied in their provinces, and that's the great thing about that Act. It may be used where it is required. Thank you, Madam Speaker. The honourable member. The honourable member for Saint-Hyacinthe-Bagotte. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I have a quick question for the Parliamentary Secretary, and I thank her for her speech. One of the elements in this arsenal, which is the Emergencies Act, is seizing bank accounts. It's been discussed a great deal in the media. So it would be up to financial institutions and banks to be the police, essentially. They'd have to self-regulate their own processes. They have to identify who participated in the siege of Ottawa, and then to investigate enough to find out whether or not if a person leaves the siege, will their bank account then be released again? Because how does all this work? Why is it up to financial institutions to police their clients' activities? It seems quite complicated to me. I will ask the Parliamentary Secretary to answer. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my colleague for his question. Of course, these measures are extraordinary, so that's what the law permits. Giving the power to financial institutions to conduct their own investigations, and they will be accompanied by the RCMP in those undertakings. We're talking about 76 personal bank accounts that were frozen, as well as some corporate accounts. We can see, therefore, that the Act is being applied in a very circumscribed manner, and the most worrisome accounts are being targeted. And I think it is worrisome to discover that most of the money that was poured into the support fund comes from outside the country. So it is important to make those links. The Honourable Member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank the Parliamentary Protective Services as well as the interpreters who are allowing us to have these debates and protecting us. Thank you to all of you. My question is, why did you wait for 3 weeks? People came from thousands of miles, thousands of kilometers away. We knew they were coming. They announced their intention of overthrowing the government if they didn't get what they wanted. They even threatened the Prime Minister. They're funded by foreign sources. So, and yet the federal government allowed the situation to deteriorate to this point. Is this not a failure on the part of the Liberal government? Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you for the question. We have heard that question many times over the last hours of debate. What I know is that there were attempts. There were meetings. There were phone calls. There were conversations. There was all kinds of reaching out, to try and resolve the situation. There were demands. They were met. There were 3 different levels of police services tried without being able to deal with the situation. And so it is a truly exceptional situation.
Member for Newmarket, Aurora.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking on the traditional territories of the Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples. I also acknowledge that my constituency is on the treaty lands of the First Nations Williams Treaty and recognize the Chippewas of Georgina Island as the closest First Nations community. Madam Speaker, it is an honor and a privilege for me to speak in this House to represent the constituents of Newmarket, Aurora. And, Madam Speaker, isn't this the important fundamental value we are here to defend? The democracy that so many people have died to defend. The reason that my parents became part of an underground escape route in Holland to help escape prisoners of war return home. And the reason that my parents came to Canada. Madam Speaker, I acknowledge that some of the people who joined the protests did so to express their opposition to vaccine mandates and with the intent to protest peacefully. But it also needs to be explicitly stated that here in Ottawa, within our country, and at our border crossings, our democracy was at risk from a dangerous extreme minority who had declared their intent to overthrow the government with their MOU. For the organizers of the blockade and occupation of Ottawa, this was not about vaccine mandates. This was just a ruse intended to damage our economy with no regard of the impact to our communities, to disrupt and shut down businesses, only revealing their contempt for Canada and the rule of law. For 3 weeks, blockades have been illegally disrupting the lives of Canadians, harming our economy, and endangering public safety. Canadians have seen their work hours reduced, or in many cases, their jobs put on hold, factories put on hold, retailers and restaurants forced to close. Let us be unwavering in our condemnation of those who set out to create an economic crisis to further disrupt supply chains and to create a climate of fear and uncertainty. The occupation of this illegal blockade and the notorious serious harm to our economy and to Canada's international standing. The world's confidence in Canada as a place to invest and to do business was being undermined. The blockade of the Ambassador Bridge has affected about $390 million in trade each day, and this bridge supports about 30% of all trade by road between Canada and the United States, and this is our most important trading partner. In Coutts, Alberta, about $48 million in trade has been affected by these blockades, and in Emerson, Manitoba, about $73 million in daily trade has been affected by these blockades. Those impacts are real. They threaten businesses big and small, and they threaten the livelihoods of Canadian workers. And recognizing all the provisions in place in our safeguard to our country, I stand here to support invoking the Emergencies Act to supplement the provincial and territorial authorities to address the blockades and the occupation to keep Canadians safe, to protect people's jobs, and to ensure our economy continues on the path of recovery while restoring confidence in our institutions. Through the Emergencies Act, we are broadening the scope of Canada's anti-money laundering and terrorist financing rules so that they can cover crowdfunding platforms and their payment service providers, including those digital assets such as cryptocurrencies. This is particularly significant, Madam Speaker, in an era where social media makes it possible to broadly distribute disinformation and raise funds on that basis. Over 55% of the funds raised on these platforms came from the United States. Through the Emergencies Act, we are providing new authorities to law enforcement to regulate crowds, to prohibit blockades, and to keep essential corridors open. The Emergency Act allows the government to mobilize essential services such as tow trucks, allows the RCMP to act more swiftly to enforce local laws, and provides enhanced power to stop the flow of money. These measures are targeted, temporary, and proportionate. Canada is a rule of law country, and by declaring the public order emergency under the Emergencies Act, we followed the law and we are acting within it. There are clear conditions set out in the Emergencies Act for a public emergency order to be declared, and our government believes that those conditions have been met, and that required the government of Canada to act. The scope of these measures will be time-limited, geographically targeted, as well as reasonable and proportionate to the threats that they are meant to address. The Emergencies Act is intended to strengthen and support law enforcement agencies at all levels across the country. This is about keeping Canadians safe, about allowing residents to go into their communities with the security and the freedom to do so, while protecting people's jobs and restoring confidence in our institutions. The Emergency Act also contains a number of significant limits, checks, and safeguards. As required by the Act, on several occasions over the past week, the Prime Minister and members of the Cabinet consulted with the premiers and members of their respective governments. And in the coming days, a parliamentary committee will be established to provide oversight while the emergency is in effect. The declaration only lasts 30 days unless renewed. However, we can and sincerely hope to revoke the emergency much sooner. Madam Speaker, I agree with the member from Saanich Gulf Islands when she said that it is not helpful to trivialize the gravity of this serious situation with references about bouncing castles, nor is it helpful to polarize this debate with antagonistic, inflammatory rhetoric and personal attacks. These are challenging times. The pandemic has impacted all of us, and for some, the impact has been one of great loss, economically and personally. Over the course of this pandemic, 36,000 Canadian lives have been lost, and more than 1.2 million Canadians have been diagnosed with COVID. And we should also remember that 2,000 Canadians who have lost who have silently lost their lives because of the COVID over the last 3 weeks. With respect to the pandemic restrictions, the majority of which are imposed provincially, are starting to be lifted. Our country has 30.7 million people, or about 80% of our population, vaccinated, and efforts continue to expand the numbers of those who have been triple vaccinated. So it is due to the efforts of so many Canadians that we stand on the threshold of a recovery, a threshold that cannot be derailed or trampled on by a minority of those whose intent was seditious and economic sabotage, with a disregard for their neighbors and the residents whose streets they occupied. Madam Speaker, this was a crisis in need of the Emergencies Act. In a letter addressed to the Minister of Public Safety and the Minister of Emergency Preparedness, the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, CAPC, stated the following: the National Confederation of the Freedom Convoy 2022 has presented unique challenges. The CAPC supports the fundamental objectives of the invocation of the Emergencies Act that is intended to regulate and prohibit illegal public assemblies that lead to the breach of peace and to restrict the funding of such illegal assemblies. Madam Speaker, I also agree with the member from Edmonton Strathcona who stated that our constituents expect us to work together and find solutions to resolve this crisis. In the weeks and months ahead, we need to restore the faith of the institutions that Canadians rely on. We need to come to a full understanding of how these blockades and the occupation were able to happen and what can be done to prevent them from happening in the future. But in doing so, we must safeguard the right to protest peacefully. And we must remember that the house we stand in belongs to all Canadians. We stand here at their will with the expectation to work in the best interests of Canadians. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Kamloops, Thompson Caribou.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Always a pleasure to rise on behalf of the people of Kamloops, Thompson Caribou. I've noticed a trend as I stand here in the House of Commons on behalf of my constituents, and it's as though the speeches coming from the government benches are pretty much exactly the same. They cite the exact same rationale in just about the exact same order. In fact, Section 21 of the Ontario Comprehensive Policing Act flies in direct and contravention to what the member said. But one thing that the member did say that caught my ear was he talked about the rhetoric and having to dial it down. Leadership starts from the top. So has he delivered that message to the Prime Minister?
Member for Newmarket, Aurora.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I appreciate the comments from the member opposite. We have been actively engaged in ongoing dialogue, and I have for 2 sittings of this House now seen the behavior of both sides of the House. And I believe that both sides of the House own the responsibility to speak responsibly, to be open-minded, and to be supportive of finding solutions. That is why Canadians sent us to this House, and that is how we should all behave.
Honorable Député de Drummond.
The Honourable Member for Drummond. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my colleague for his speech. Madam Speaker, the Emergencies Act should only apply in the face of a crisis, a current or imminent situation. The situation that we've seen for the last 3 years over on the parliamentary precinct seems to be resolved or soon will be. Does my colleague still believe that it is appropriate to invoke this Emergencies Act?
For Newmarket, Aurora.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I also appreciate the question from the member opposite. We're not sure that this is over yet, Madam Speaker. There have been people who have vacated the precinct that is being protected currently, but there's also dialogue and discussion about coming back and returning. And there's also dialogue about regrouping. And so I think it's important for us to maintain vigilance and to monitor the process as it goes forward and be ready to respond when it's appropriate.
Member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Speaker, and I would like to thank my colleague for his comments today. One of the things that I'm very, very concerned about that we are seeing across the country right now is attacks on the media. I was just reading an article about attacks that have been happening in British Columbia against media. Obviously, we've seen some horrific assaults happen in Ottawa against members of the media. I'm just wondering what the government's plans are, what steps they will be taking to ensure that we are protecting journalists, that we are protecting those who are working so hard to tell their stories and to share information with Canadians.
Honourable Member for Newmarket Aurora.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I also want to thank the member opposite for her question. I think protecting a free press is critically important for any democracy, and it is the press that shines the light on the issues. What I'm particularly proud of is the independent ability for the media in Canada to present the facts as we go forward. And so I agree with her. It's very critical that we should be going forward and making sure that we do have a free press that is protected and that has the same rights as anyone else who's seeking to report the facts to our communities.
A member for Hamilton East, Stony Creek.
Thanks, Madam Speaker. And I want to thank the member from Newmarket Aurora for his comments earlier. Great speech as always, a lot of experience from the member. I want to speak to the question that was asked and posed by the member of Kamloops Thompson Caribou when he talked about consulting with and looking at leadership from the top. As you know, Madam Speaker, we've consulted with the Premier of Ontario, who has supported the act that's been presented here this evening. We've consulted with the Mayor of Ottawa, who has supported the act that's being presented here this evening. And we've consulted with the Mayor of Windsor, who declared an emergency and supports what we're doing here this evening. So can the member comment on consultation with municipalities and the Premier of Ontario as it relates to the act that's been presented here tonight in the House?
Member for Newmarket Aurora in 20 seconds.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. I certainly appreciate working with him on the HUMA committee. Both of us have some municipal background, and both of us understand the need to consult at the municipal, the regional, the provincial, and the federal level. And I believe those consultations have been undertaken, and the decisions that were made were as a result of the consultations that were undertaken.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Port Moody Coquitlam. And if I may suggest that, yes, just lifting your mic a little bit. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'll begin my comments by highlighting what we are all agreeing on in this House. In the past few days of debate, I have heard agreement that we must denounce hate and hate symbols. Let's build on that consensus, because it has been exposed this past month that there is a far-right, sinister element that infiltrated the convoys at the highest levels. They are organized, well-funded, and have a stated goal of overthrowing our elected government. I take that threat very seriously. I heard most members of this House denounce these bad actors and recognize that their actions and intentions do not represent the Canada we want to pass on to the next generation. These are serious times, Madam Speaker, that call for serious debate and action that is appropriate and proportionate to the severity of this dangerous situation we find ourselves in. And let me be clear, these occupations are dangerous. They are not peaceful. They are unlawful. They never should have been allowed to become entrenched in our communities. And let me be clear that governments did have the resources to halt the occupation of Ottawa early on, but they failed to respond with the urgency required. Why do I say that? Because on social media, convoy organizers were openly sharing their intent, including plans for once they got to Ottawa. There was endless coverage of the convoy as it moved across Canada, and it was known from the beginning that factions of the convoy...
I interrupt the Honourable Member. Point of order from the Honourable Member for North Island, Powell River.
Well, thank you so much, and I honestly apologize for interrupting my colleague. I just want to make sure that she did remember to share her time with a member from Vancouver Kingsway.
Thank you so much, the Honourable Member for Port Moody Coquitlam.
Thank you, and I'm sorry I did forget that. So yes, I'll be sharing my time. Thank you. So there was factions of that convoy that were displaying symbols of hate. hate that was not taken seriously by governments and has not been taken serious for years. What has become clear through these last several weeks is that Canada does not have the tools to deal with hate or disinformation that is growing across our communities. The fear, intimidation, and lawlessness that has evolved on the streets of Ottawa and at borders across the country have shone a magnifying glass on how the government systems are not equipped to uphold even the most basic laws when hate and disinformation rear their ugly head and when white privilege underpins it. It has become glaringly obvious to Canadians that government let them down, left them on their own to deal with the consequences of unlawful occupations in their communities. This reality is threatening the safety of citizens. And the very...
And I ask the Honourable Member for Don Valley East to please put himself on mute.
Have my time back from that?
Of course. No, we stopped counting the time. No, absolutely. And I apologize for the interruption. The honourable member may start again. Yes.
Thank you. This reality is threatening the safety of citizens, institutions, and the very sovereignty of the country. We know this threat is real and that the online environment is amplifying it. The power of online disinformation can be exemplified by the varied reports of a protester being trampled by a police horse this weekend. A phone call to my office Friday, I picked it up from a distraught constituent, as well as emails reported one victim was taken. One victim was a woman, or they were a senior woman, or they are a senior woman with a walker, or they were an Indigenous elder, that they suffered a shoulder injury, or maybe a horse stepped on their face and throat, or maybe they lost a limb or death. The only consistencies were inconsistencies in those stories. Madam Speaker, it's time to get serious about the very dangerous consequences of the spread of disinformation, which gave rise to the length and size of the unlawful occupation in Ottawa, along with occupations and blockades across Canada. Again, I will say it should not have come to this, but it did. So let's stop looking backwards in this House and start looking forward and acknowledging the facts we are dealing with. When Ottawa called a state of emergency, it did not stop the lawlessness on our streets. When Ontario called a state of emergency, it did not stop the lawlessness. And when Indigenous leaders called for the occupiers to go home, they did not. It was only when the Emergencies Act was invoked that finally there was some initial resolution to this unlawful attack on the rights and freedoms of the citizens of Ottawa. The interim chief of the Ottawa Police has been clear that without these additional powers, they would not have been able to achieve the outcomes so far. Now, many people, many members have spoken about how the threats are now over, but I want to share with this House what's happening in BC. Protests are building here, and the agitators are increasingly aggressive. The RCMP had to preemptively close down the border yesterday, and 16 were arrested. Other unlawful activity could not be addressed on the spot due to lack of resources. And here is another really sad security threat. Private citizens are now feeling compelled to stand up against these aggressors. In Vancouver yesterday, convoy supporters and counter-protesters were facing off in the streets. And in BC, at YVR, police presence has been increased and borders in these times is mounting. And I have to share, Madam Speaker, that in the riding next to mine, the home of the Provincial Minister of Public Safety was affronted yesterday by protesters. In BC, this is far from over. The NDP takes the invocation of the Emergency Act under public disorder very seriously. We've said over and over again that we will not give a blank check to the government. The government will have to stay within the established powers, or we will withdraw any support. We will continue to protect peaceful protesters, including land defenders, and will protect the charter rights for all Canadians. Going forward, the federal government and all levels of government need to take responsibility for their failures, for not taking seriously the very real safety threats and infringements on the rights and freedoms that the majority of Canadians have endured these past weeks. Going forward, they must accept and address the very real threats of intolerance, hate, discrimination, and disinformation happening online and manifesting physically in our communities across Canada. These are real threats to the safety and security of every person and the institutions in this country, as well as our democracy and sovereignty. The NDP has consistently shown leadership during these occupations and has used the tools available as the progressive opposition to act. We've moved motions to investigate and expose weaknesses in crowdfunding platforms, brought forward an emergency debate on the occupation of Ottawa, and tabled bills in this House to address hate and hate symbols. The NDP has shown leadership in standing up for healthcare workers, frontline and essential workers, and all workers who have gotten us through these 2 years of difficult times. We continue to stand up for them. While the NDP has been focused on solutions, there has been a lack of forward thinking and leadership by this government. Madam Speaker, this government has failed in so many ways. They failed to take seriously the declining standard of living for Canadians. They are no longer in touch with what is really happening in our communities. The years of neglect for the need for affordable housing, not addressing the climate crisis with urgency, declining to introduce pharmacare, not addressing Canadians' high cell phone bills. I could go on. This government has created an environment where too many Canadians are hurting. And when people are hurting, when things are desperate, people can easily find themselves being taken advantage of by sinister actors that exploit those vulnerabilities for their personal gain. It's the job of parliamentarians to protect Canadians from that. It is late, Madam Speaker, and in this 11th hour, there is still work to be done to protect Canadians from the very real threat of hate and discrimination that fed off the vulnerabilities of exhausted, scared, and anxious Canadians who live in every riding of this country. What manifested in Ottawa, in Coutts, in Windsor, and in Surrey, and in Winnipeg is no accident. It is well-funded, well-organized, and exploitation of the weaknesses in our government and government systems that has led to hate and disinformation spread, and it's not over yet. In closing, I must look to the future too, and so I call in all my colleagues to support the NDP's private members bill C-229, which would prevent anyone from selling and displaying symbols that promote hatred and violence in this country going forward.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. And I do acknowledge it's nice to see that the New Democratic Party recognizes the true value of the Emergencies Act. It's legislation that is actually required. We've seen the interim chief here in Ottawa. We've had asks from the province of Ontario, the trading corridors that she's made reference to. And we can talk about that, but for me personally, it's all about the people and the freedom of the people to be able to live in peace, to have those jobs, to not feel threatened. She makes reference to the whole issue of racism that we saw raise its ugly head during the blockades and so forth. And I'm wondering if she could provide her thoughts in regards to why it was important for Ottawa to work with the province of Ontario, the municipality of Ottawa and others to be able to resolve this issue.
Honourable Member for Port Moody Coquitlam.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. And I will just highlight that I do value protecting innocent Canadians that are just trying to pay their mortgages and keep their livelihoods going during these very, very difficult times. And I will say that in BC, we heard yesterday that many arrests could not be done because of the fact that there were not enough resources, and that the RCMP committed to ensuring that those unlawful acts would be followed up on in a separate time and in a separate place because they did not have the resources to keep everyone safe.
Questions and comments, the Honourable Member for Calgary Shepherd.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So a question to the member. One of the provisions in the Emergencies Act is warrantless search and seizure, especially the freezing of accounts of those who are either known to be connected to the protesters outside who were there, or people who are related to them. That could happen further down. I'd like to hear the member comment on the fact that the government no longer needs to go to a judge to obtain a warrant to actually freeze a bank account or financial assets anymore. And if she has any concerns whatsoever that the government could abuse this because there is no longer judicial oversight.
For Port Moody, Coquitlam.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. And I will just remind the member that it was the NDP that first identified the fact that online platforms and crowdfunding platforms were being used outside of the country to fuel and to pay for these illegal occupations.
Questions et commentaires, l'honorable.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Jonquière. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Like my colleague, I define myself as progressive. And we know that often emancipation movements take the form of protests. So I don't think that the arguments of the protesters are valid, but I'm worried about seeing this Emergencies Act, which will in the future limit people who do have valid arguments and who want to change society for the better. So doesn't my colleague believe that this will create a worrying precedent?
Member for Port Moody, Coquitlam.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And again, thank you to my colleague for the question. And the NDP have been very clear that we fully support peaceful protesting, the exercising of the right to gather together and to fight for ideas and for change in the government. And we absolutely protect the right of land defenders, environmentalists, those that take part in peaceful protests. What we saw over these last few weeks, Madam Speaker, was unlawful occupations.
Member for Kitchener Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and through you, my thanks to the member for Port Moody Coquitlam, both for the tone and the substance of her advocacy in this place. I really appreciate. My question is, I'm curious to hear more from her with respect to the scope of the regulation. We've heard some members of the governing party share that it's meant to be a very targeted approach, but we also see in the regulation itself talk of critical infrastructure used quite broadly, bus stations, ferry terminals, lighthouses, for example. So I'm curious to hear the member's perspective on ensuring that it is kind of appropriate in scale and does it set precedent for those that were mentioned previously with respect to Indigenous land defenders and climate activists, for example.
Well, member for Port Moody, Coquitlam in 15, 20 seconds.
Thank you, and thank you to the member. And I'll go back to what I was saying on the first response to one of the members that asked me a question in the House, that I value and the NDP values protecting the rights of Canadians. And right now, the rights of Canadians widely has felt at risk. And we're looking to restore confidence and security in our institutions in Canada.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Madam Speaker, we come together today at a precarious moment in our nation's history. Over the last month, a cascading series of intelligence, policing, and governance failures have resulted in an unprecedented situation of which no Canadian of any persuasion is content or approves. We have all witnessed a siege of our nation's capital, an economic blockade of our international borders, and threats to the political stability of our society. Ironically, Canadians on all sides of the issues feel abandoned. Public confidence has been shaken and communities are divided. The institutions citizens expect to protect them have proved unresponsive. They have looked for leadership in their governments that has not been delivered. In speaking to many constituents in Vancouver Kingsway, two things are crystal clear. First, the current crisis has been badly mismanaged by the Prime Minister, who was virtually absent as it developed. And second, this situation should never have gotten this far.
And so it disappoints me profoundly to see our Parliament have to debate the application of measures that are by design intended for the most serious situations of turmoil and danger. Nonetheless, it is in crisis that we indeed find our nation. As such, it is for us to determine the best course of action to restore public confidence, stability, and security to our society. I would like to state that this is also a time of great sensitivity and emotion. The issues engage cherished principles that are equally valued and difficult to reconcile. And I think that thoughtful people of good faith can rationally differ with views that deserve respect and careful consideration. I believe our nation could use a generous application of compassion and understanding. Now, at the outset, I think it's important to delineate what the present situation is, and just as importantly, what it is not. First, we are not dealing with a peaceful protest. We are dealing with an economic blockade accompanied by both threats and actual violence, with an attempt to force political change by mob behavior and, in substance, hostage diplomacy. A review of the facts bears this out. We saw a serious border closure at the Ambassador Bridge, interrupting some $350 million of trade every day and threatening Canada-US trade relations. Canada's crucial auto industry and manufacturing sector in the Golden Horseshoe were affected at a time of already constrained supply chains. A cache of weapons and murder conspiracy charges emerged in Coutts, Alberta. We witnessed a blockade for nearly a month in our nation's capital, with citizens threatened, workers intimidated, and hundreds of businesses shut down. Undercover intelligence revealed plans to expand the border blockade to other essential Canadian infrastructure, including airports and ports. There was released an openly publicized manifesto calling for government change. We have seen foreign interference and funding in our domestic political affairs. There is far-right involvement with clear connections to the same forces who led the charge on Washington last January. We have seen threats to towing companies and drivers to intimidate them into not doing their jobs. And we have seen the use of heavy equipment, tractors and trailers as weapons of blockade. The events of the last 2 days further bear this out. Blockade participants have refused to leave the parliamentary precinct when ordered to do so, assaulted police officers, tried to seize their weapons, thrown bicycles at mounted officers, and spat upon and assaulted journalists. These are not the acts of peaceful protesters. Second, this was never really about truckers. This is rendered nakedly bare by the fact that not a single demand was ever made to address the real issues truckers face, like low wages, long hours, fatigue, occupational safety, inadequate rest stops, poor road conditions, or high expenses. And it was never truly about truckers' vaccine policies either. This is also easily seen by the fact that it is the United States that set a requirement that all Canadian truckers must be vaccinated in order to enter the country, and that nothing done in Canada could alter that fact. Third, the legislation before us is not the War Measures Act. As a New Democrat, I've always taken tremendous pride in the moral courage that Tommy Douglas demonstrated in opposing Pierre Trudeau's invocation of the War Measures Act, despite strong public support for the move. In 1970, civil liberties were suspended, the military was deployed, and hundreds of innocent people were arbitrarily rounded up and held without charge. Habeas corpus was suspended by cabinet fiat with no recourse to democratic institutions or the courts. None of that is occurring here. Unlike the War Measures Act, the Emergencies Act does not suspend Canadian civil rights. Emergency orders are subject to judicial review and must be charter compliant. Indeed, in 1970, Canada did not even have a Charter of Rights with constitutional force. Unlike the War Measures Act, the Emergencies Act is subject to extensive parliamentary oversight and democratic protections. For example, this very debate we are having was triggered by the declaration of a public order emergency. Parliament will have the opportunity to affirm or revoke the declaration tomorrow. A parliamentary committee will be able to amend or revoke all emergency orders, and a motion signed by 20 MPs can trigger a vote on revoking the declaration. The truth is that the Emergencies Act has many legal and parliamentary protections, as it was expressly designed to do. I also think it's important to note that the 6 measures applied under the Act are targeted in scope, duration, and purpose. It is critical to remember that they provide powers to address the current crisis that would not otherwise be possible, like ensuring that towing equipment can be marshaled to clear heavy machinery used to block public roads, criminalizing the supply of goods to blockades that were crippling our nation's capital, and interrupting the flow of foreign funding to interfere in our domestic political affairs. On this latter point, I want to say this. Over 50% of the funds used to support the blockade came from outside Canada. Hundreds of donors were Americans who have been linked to far-right groups or those involved in attempting an insurrection at the U.S. Capitol last January. This constitutes direct foreign interference in Canadian domestic affairs that cannot be tolerated. To my Conservative and Bloc colleagues who oppose the emergency measures used to intercept and freeze these funds, I ask this. If we substituted Russian for American donors, sending money to try to change Canadian government policy, would they still have no problem with this? I know the answer. To me, it is imperative for the sovereignty, territorial, and security interests of Canada that we act strongly and resolutely to address foreign interference in our internal political affairs. Madam Speaker, some have argued that invoking the Emergencies Act will set a dangerous precedent that could be applied in the future to disruptive protests that are otherwise peaceful. They say Parliament should not act, lest it start down a slippery slope to irresponsible behavior. Somewhat ironically, this is said by members of the Bloc Québécois and Conservative parties whose own provincial cousins have invoked the notwithstanding clause of the Charter of Rights to actually violate the rights of their own citizens, something the Emergencies Act does not do. Apparently, their concern for slippery slopes does not extend to their own sectarian interests. I fundamentally agree that the right of peaceful protest is indispensable in a free and democratic society and must never be subject to unreasonable limitations. But I categorically reject the assertion that we cannot act in appropriate circumstances because future parliamentarians may not do so. I also believe that every single parliamentarian today and in the future well knows that this legislation is extraordinarily targeted and reserved for the rarest of circumstances. I trust in their judgment, in the Canadian public, and our institutions to ensure that happens. Finally, Madam Speaker, others have argued that this crisis does not meet the threshold set out in the Emergencies Act for the declaration of a public order emergency. I have carefully read the Act and agree that reasonable people may disagree on this point. While I respect those who feel otherwise, it is my view that given the facts that have emerged over the last 4 weeks, that the Act is properly engaged. Further, I believe that the invocation of the Act is already proving to be effective in resolving the crisis, paralysis, and threats that so clearly have gripped our nation. I strongly agree with those who argue that the invocation of public order emergencies should never be normalized. Instead, it should be reserved only for rare circumstances such as this, where decisive action is needed to address urgent threats to the security of Canada. If we hope to emerge from this pandemic as a strong and united country, then every member of this House must put aside their partisan political interests and work together to regain the public's confidence. Rather than wedge politics and polarization, Canadians need honesty, accountability, and responsible leadership from their elected representatives. I believe, Madam Speaker, it's time for all parliamentarians to provide just that. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Just to kind of pick up on what the member just stated, and as you know, at this time in which we're talking about the Emergency Act, how much better it would have been if we could have been talking about the heroes of the pandemic. You know, here we are approaching that 3-year mark, and at the end of the day, there's been so much good that has taken place. But going to his speech, there's a couple of points I want to highlight. One is the importance and supremacy of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, because we hear the word freedom a lot during this debate, and how the Emergency Act does not override any aspect of the Charter. And the second, and the member made reference to it, at any point in time. There's 4 political entities in this House that have more than 20 members. All it takes is 20 members to have a vote for revocation at any point in time. And if he can just pick up on those points, I would appreciate it.
Honourable Member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Well, thank you. I guess I hear two main points. The first one, I think, is it does give us an opportunity again to thank all of the frontline workers and healthcare workers in this country who, while we debate this legislation, are tasked with the critical job of dealing with our people who are vulnerable, helping patients, and still getting us through what is still a pandemic. I think that's always important to keep in mind as our attention is taken elsewhere. Second of all, it was a major part of my research and speech to note that the Emergencies Act was carefully crafted in response to the excesses of the War Measures Act and contains within it many parliamentary oversights and restrictions and careful parameters to ensure that the excesses of the War Measures Act are not repeated. So I think that's also a very vital point to make to Canadians, to assure them that their rights remain paramount, even with the invocation of the Emergencies Act.
Member for South Shore St. Margaret's.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I appreciate the respectful tone that the member for Vancouver Kingsway has taken in his presentation tonight, and I offer my observations and comments in the same light. I've heard often, not from your presentation directly, but from the members of the NDP and the members of the Liberal Party throughout today and the debate on Saturday and Thursday, the use of the word sedition, which is a very, very powerful word that I think is being often abused in the discussion around this. So my question or observation is that there's very strong tools for the government under Section 46 of the Criminal Code to deal with treason and sedition. And my question is if the government believes that this is treason and sedition, then perhaps they should have used that tool. And if that's the case, why hasn't anyone been charged under that?
Honourable Member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Well, I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for his question, and he raises, I think, a very important point, which is the Emergencies Act is supposed to be triggered only when the current laws in Canada are proved ineffective in dealing with the current situation. I think that word ineffective is very important. If I can take just one or two examples, the current laws, for instance, have proved ineffective in stopping the flow of funds and money and supplies into the blockade in Ottawa. It's not a crime to walk down the street carrying a gas can full of gasoline. There is no law in Canada that would prevent that. But of course, by invoking the Emergencies Act and saying that anybody who's supplying the blockades that are illegal, that now becomes a criminal act. That's an example where the Emergencies Act was necessary for that. Another one has been in towing. I think it was not an accident that this very well-organized blockade used heavy equipment and machinery to block public roadways in this country. When towing companies and trucks were being intimidated, there's no way to actually commandeer or get those companies working to clear the roadways except by the invocation of the Emergencies Act. So there's a couple of examples why I think it's necessary to have that special power.
The Deputy de Drummond.
The Honourable Member for Drummond. Well, I believe that our colleague was slightly disrespectful to Quebec in his speech, and I would like to raise that. He said that Quebec used the notwithstanding clause to violate its own citizens' rights. This is either contempt or ignorance from our colleague. And in either case, this is unacceptable. However, I have a question. What is happening right now could create a dangerous precedent. Madam Speaker, what if in 10 years in Quebec or in Canada, we see something like what happened in 2012, in the spring of 2012, when students in Quebec protested and some radical groups infiltrated the demonstrations? And what happens if a more rightist government is in power at that point? If the same Emergency Measures Act is invoked at that time, will the NDP be able to say, okay, this time we're not supporting it?
A very brief answer from the Honourable Member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Well, again, I think the Emergencies Act is relegated to specific circumstances, and every time it's possibly invoked, it needs to be carefully studied. But to my honourable colleague, I wonder if he's worried that provinces might use the notwithstanding clause more often. Is he worried about a slippery slope when, and of course, notwithstanding clauses are only engaged when there's an acknowledgement that the charter rights of the citizens have been violated. Otherwise, you don't need to use the notwithstanding act. So that was my point. And I just wonder if he should have a conversation with his provincial colleagues in Quebec to warn them that using the notwithstanding clause may lead to a slippery slope where they're tempted to do it again. I don't think that's a valid.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Hamilton East, Stony Creek.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you for your time today in the chair. You've been here since early morning, so I appreciate the service you provided to the House. And I'll be sharing, please note, Madam Speaker, that I'll be sharing my time this evening with the member from Kitty Bathurst. Madam Speaker, I think it's important for us to put into context what's transpired over the last number of weeks as it relates to events here in the City of Ottawa and at various other locations in Canada. For the vast majority of us in the chamber, we're visitors to the City of Ottawa. We reside here on a temporary basis with our principal residents back home in our respective ridings, and for me, Madam Speaker, that's Hamilton East, Stony Creek. For the past 3 weeks, I've spent many days here in the nation's capital, watching the occupation grow in size and spread through the downtown, well beyond the parliamentary precinct and into residential neighborhoods surrounding where we meet here today. And during that time, the downtown descended into chaos, upending the lives of those people who reside here in the city center. I've had the opportunity to speak to many people here in the downtown who've been impacted by the occupation, and they've made it clear to me that they're accustomed to visitors in the city. On any given day of the year, Madam Speaker, it's not uncommon to witness protests, demonstrations, vigils, or ceremonial activities in and around the parliamentary precinct. Peaceful activities are not only welcome, but they're encouraged by the people who live here in Ottawa. Unfortunately, what we've witnessed over the past 3 weeks was at times neither peaceful nor lawful. What started as a protest quickly turned into an occupation. And for those of us in the chamber, Madam Speaker, who've served at the municipal level as city or town councillors, or possibly as a mayor, we know it's not uncommon to receive calls for service related to municipal bylaws. We know that municipal bylaws are important as they keep the city moving and provide an element of protection for law-abiding citizens. I wasn't surprised, to be honest, Madam Speaker, to hear that over 3,700 notices of violation have been issued to date here in the City of Ottawa. These violations, and to be clear, there have been thousands of violations that occurred without enforcement, significantly impacted the quality of life for everyone who resides in the downtown area. As has been reported in the media, residents have been subjected to illegal and tortuous behavior. I try to picture what's occurred here in Ottawa and think about how the occupation would be received by my own constituents in Hamilton East, Stony Creek, or other communities across the country. I want to be clear, Madam Speaker, that for those of us who have been here temporarily, residing here temporarily, we witnessed over the last 3 weeks displays, firework displays at 1 and 2 a.m. in the morning on a regular basis. We witnessed, even through the period of the injunction, the constant honking of horns, the use of whistles, bells, and other noisemakers, again, sometimes well into the early morning hours. We witnessed the illegal confiscation of public property, the blockade of public streets that led to the detour and cancellation of public transit routes, and prohibited first responders from accessing people in downtown Ottawa, police, fire, and ambulatory services. We witnessed trucks and vehicles parked on public sidewalks, many of them illegally parked throughout the core of the city, preventing access to businesses. And sadly, Madam Speaker, many of those businesses had to close. We read with horror and disgust about a report from local police that there was a concerted effort to tie up the 911 lines here in Ottawa, a campaign planned to prevent the people from Ottawa from accessing emergency services provided by police, fire, and ambulatory staff. We witnessed the illegal erection of cranes, stages, tents, and other permanent structures in the middle of residential streets. On the hour, Madam Speaker, we witnessed the people haphazardly transporting fuel on city sidewalks to encampment areas as part of the occupation that occurred here in the downtown. We witnessed illegal fires and barbecues on city sidewalks and city parking lots. And I'm sure everyone in this House is aware of the fact that there was a fire started in the lobby of an Ottawa apartment building here in the city centre. We witnessed the harassment of local residents who in their daily travels were mocked and chastised for wearing masks as they went about their lives, minding their own business. Madam Speaker, this is just a brief description of what's transpired here over the last 3 weeks, and I know very well how my residents would react to these illegal actions. They wouldn't be tolerated. And there would be an expectation that those responsible for upholding the law would attend and restore the peace and ensure their rights were upheld as tenants and property owners. Ottawa residents want their lives back. They want a peaceful night's sleep. They want their public transit back. They want access to roads and sidewalks. They want to see businesses reopen. People want to go back to work. They want their city back. The only way to restore the peace and some sense of normalcy is with all three levels of government working together. I want to publicly commend at this point in time in the House, Madam Speaker, the Premier of Ontario for his support. Instead of handing out coffee and donuts like members of the opposition, he declared a state of emergency here in the province. And instead of taking selfies with those that illegally occupied downtown Ottawa and blocked the Ambassador Bridge in Windsor, he signed an order that seeks to assist the City of Ottawa and complement the actions of the federal government. He appropriately described the situation as a siege and the illegal actions as holding millions and millions of people hostage. Madam Speaker, compare and contrast the Premier's comments to those of the interim leader of the opposition. The interim leader of the opposition stated, "I don't think we should be asking them to go home," if you can believe that, Madam Speaker. Then has been the trademark of the official opposition. The flip-flop statement soon followed from the same member, and just over a week ago, the interim leader finally recognized that the extent of the damage inflicted upon the City of Ottawa, its citizens, and the Canadian economy had reached a breaking point. By the time she issued your uninvited speech, the damage was already done. The hollow words that it was time to take down the barricades, stop the disruptive action, and come together were delivered too little, too late. Madam Speaker, I think it's imperative that we recognize the joint forces that have come together here over the past number of days. It is, as Ottawa's interim police chief described it, a real Canadian effort. I come from a police family, and as a city councillor for 26 years, I served for many years on the city's police services board. I'm a strong supporter of the police, and so I was pleased to hear that 28 members of Hamilton's police services are here in Ottawa to assist with efforts to restore peace and return the city to its citizens. Members of the Hamilton Police Service have joined officers from Toronto, Sudbury, York, Kingston, Peel, Durham, London, Calgary, Edmonton, and other jurisdictions. The ugly side of the occupation continues to be laid bare on television over the last couple of days. Extraordinary scenes of people spitting on officers, berating law enforcement officials, throwing objects at police and their horses, and other disruptive activities with the sole objectives of standing in the way of reclaiming the city and upholding the rule of law. We heard here in Ottawa that the local police needed additional support, additional resources and tools to confront a national event in an area that falls under the jurisdiction of the local police services. To date, the police have shown great restraint, Madam Speaker, even while under attack, and as has been reported, the police have been the target of protesters not just here in Ottawa, but at other locations across Canada, including southern Alberta. The domestic terrorist plot in Alberta highlights and emphasizes the need for all levels of government to provide the police with the appropriate level of support and necessary tools to keep their members and the public safe, and we're doing that here tonight. I look forward to the studies and the inquiry that will follow, reviews that will help us plan for future events that will occur, whether they occur here in Windsor, Coutts, Ottawa, or elsewhere. We can't sit on our hands and hope that the problems will go away on their own, as the official opposition has suggested. Madam Speaker, we need to fully understand how the illegal blockades and illegal occupations were planned and funded. The recommendations we ultimately
the honourable member may complete on the questions and comments. The honourable member for Calgary-Shepherd.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So, to the member, if this was an honest attempt by the government to try and include the official opposition and convince us that the Emergencies Act use was warranted, that it had met the threshold, then I thought that what the government side would have done is give us all the briefing material, give us the evidence, give us the facts, release it, make the judicial opinion from Justice Canada officials public. They didn't do any of those things. In fact, I distinctly remember on Wednesday morning, before our National Caucus meeting even began, we came to the reporters and told them very clearly, the House Leader on the opposition side did, that we were not provided any documentation in order for our caucus to make a decision based on what evidence the government actually has in its hands. This isn't a good faith attempt to go, work across both sides of the aisle. This is a politically driven use of the Emergencies Act to save the leadership of the Prime Minister and nothing else. I don't have a question for the member, just want to put that on the record. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member for Hamilton East, Stony Creek.
Madam Chairman, and it's ironic that the member doesn't have a question because, I think millions of Canadians have watched over the last couple of days in terms of what has transpired here in Ottawa. And I think what he has ignored and his party has ignored is the impact that it's had on Ottawa citizens. In fact, the member from Ottawa Carleton today stood up and talked about what's happening in Canada. As an Ottawa representative, not once did he reference what's happening here in the city of Ottawa. I think they're ignoring what's happening to the people who here in Ottawa and the impact that it's having on people's daily lives, Madam Speaker.
Honourable member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Madam Speaker, and I would like to thank my colleague for his contribution today. I have to say it's been a very odd day in the House of Commons when the Conservatives are choosing to negatively attack the Premier of Ontario, and the Liberals are standing for him. It is a unique moment in time for us today, Madam Speaker. My question is to do with premiers, Conservative premiers in this country. On February 4th, the Premier of my province, Premier Kenney, asked the federal government to help, that there was a need for help to stop the blockades in Coutts, that the provincial government was unable to manage the blockades in Coutts. Of course, on February 18th, he has now decided he's going to sue the federal government, and I would like just some information on how the member feels about this sort of flip-flopping between requiring help and then wanting to take the same people you're asking for help to court.
The honourable member for Hamilton East, Stony Creek.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I really appreciate the question from the member. And as she noted, it's been a flip-flop of events in Alberta in terms of asking for help and then criticizing the government when they actually acted upon their requests that came from the province. And of course, as she mentioned, here in the province of Ontario, the Premier of Ontario has declared a state of emergency. That's what this act does here tonight. It declares a state of emergency and gives provinces the ability to deal with protesters, whether they're in blockades or occupations like we see here in Ottawa.
The honourable member for Saint-Hyacinthe. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would just like to summarize the situation. I'd like to thank my colleague for her speech. But if we look at these financing platforms that would be at the center of the Emergencies Act, and it's already under the jurisdiction of the provinces, being arrested for a crime is already, of course, covered by legislation. Same holds true for uttering threats. Same thing for possessing unlicensed weapons and firearms. So I'd like to ask my colleague, in the end, what's the point of the Emergencies Act in this case if there's already a regular legal arsenal and conventional institutions that could have been used over the last 2 weeks and were not used?
East Stony Creek.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Speaker. And I think what the member, and I thank him for his question, I think what he has ignored through his question is the fact that provinces are asking for additional tools to deal with the occupation and the blockades. And so we know very well that when thank you very much. I think we know very well that the Act has allowed provinces, specifically here in Ontario, to bring law enforcement from other provinces without swearing them in. The Act has allowed us to crack down on investments and donations that have been made from outside of the country. And so the Act has helped us over the last 7 days. There's been a lot of praise over the last couple of days in terms of what the City of Ottawa has done and their police force has done to clear the parliamentary precinct in the downtown. That's been done with the help of the Act.
Resuming debate. Reprise du débat. L'honorable député.
The Honourable Member for Acadie-Bathurst. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would like to thank my newly elected colleague for having shared his time with me this evening, from the member for Hamilton Stony Creek. Once again, Madam Speaker, thank you for allowing me to address the House tonight. My riding of Acadie-Bathurst is one of the most beautiful places in our country. The people are warm and generous beyond compare. My riding has many generations of culturally diverse families who've pulled together against all odds. My community would simply not exist were it not for these long-standing stories of families helping each other. It saddens me deeply to see what's been happening in our country over the last few weeks, to see fellow citizens turning their backs on each other. This is not the Canada I know and love. I understand that many Canadians are frustrated and angry. I am as fed up as anyone with this pandemic. I also understand that as a Member of Parliament, my responsibility is to listen to people and look for ways to help them. Unfortunately, some people who want to make their voices heard have also chosen to draw the nation's attention to themselves by displaying extremely worrisome behavior. Madam Speaker, I believe I bring some personal experience with regard when it comes to protests. The people in my riding of Acadie-Bathurst have always been very vocal. People in my riding are not afraid to protest. Sometimes it was for civil rights or language rights. In 2013, it was over the Conservatives' reform of the employment insurance program. Protesting is a fundamental and important part of a democratic nation. I have always supported the right of people to protest peacefully, even in front of my own office, and I have participated in several protests before and since my election. That said, I will never support bullying, threats, physical altercations, damage to private property, theft, symbols of hatred, or the defacing of cherished monuments. There also seems to be a widespread misunderstanding that citizens have the right to bring semi-trailers to a protest and then block streets for 3 weeks. Nowhere in the Charter does it say that this is a right. When a group's actions are no longer to make their voice heard and they start intentionally causing harm to people or damage to infrastructure, it's no longer a protest. It is an occupation and an attack on our democracy. I am so saddened that these blockades are taking place, not only in front of children, but that children are being used strategically to advance causes that they cannot understand at that age. I sincerely hope that those involved in these blockades will reconsider their behavior and strive to set stronger and more positive examples to our youth for the sake of our democracy. Respect for the law is our most basic responsibility as citizens of this country. Madam Speaker, we know that many of the people protesting have legitimate concerns and are genuinely worried about their future and their livelihoods. What is frustrating, however, is that the concerns of so many of these people would be alleviated if they could simply trust the science. We are fortunate in Canada to have world-class doctors and scientists to guide us through this pandemic. Thousands of scientists around the world have dedicated their lives to protecting and preserving the lives of others. Never before have human beings been so scientifically advanced. Let me say it clearly, slowly, and surely for all Canadians to hear. Vaccines work. We are almost 2 years into this COVID-19 pandemic, and I will always be grateful to the people who developed these miraculous and effective vaccines. Thanks to them, countless lives have been saved and will be saved in the future. So, back to the topic of the day. Yes, some of the protesters are concerned about vaccination mandates, masks, and lockdowns. However, other elements of these protests have deep, dark roots in far-right ideologies and have dangerous links to organized crime, as well as foreign interference with financial donations that are of great concern. Whatever the motivations of those participating in these protests, we cannot allow them to continue to disrupt the peace and peaceful lives of citizens. All Canadians deserve to live in peace. For 3 weeks, we have seen municipal and provincial leaders raise their hands Madam Speaker, the fact is that we have exhausted all other options. I am convinced beyond the shadow of a doubt that the circumstances unfolding in this country meet the threshold required by law for the declaration of a national emergency. I am convinced and geographic. The Prime Minister and the Minister of Justice have repeatedly said these measures will be used with great restraint and are both limited in time and geographically targeted. Madam Speaker, the fact is that we have exhausted all other options. I am convinced beyond the shadow of a doubt that the circumstances unfolding in this country meet the threshold required by law for the declaration of a national emergency. Let's focus for a moment on what is happening in Ottawa. It's been clear from day one, when the convoy situation unfolded on Parliament Hill, that the Ottawa police were not prepared to deal with it. I'm not saying that as an accusation, and I cannot speak to the resources that were or were not available to the City Police. I can only say what I saw and what we all saw, which was that the Ottawa police were not going to be able to deal with this situation without support. I had the advantage of waking up tonight, at the end of the weekend, knowing how things have unfolded over the last few days with a major police operation underway. I think most of my colleagues will agree with me that the police operation in downtown Ottawa over the past weekend has been an unqualified success. There are fewer trucks, fewer protesters, fewer blocked streets, and fewer reports of intimidation and violence. We now have concrete evidence that the powers conferred by the Emergencies Act have had a significant impact. These measures have enabled directed action that would not otherwise have been possible. Acting Chief Bell of the Ottawa Police Services stated that the scale and scope of this weekend's operation would not have been possible without the emergency being declared. Madam Speaker, in closing, thanks to the Emergencies Act, the federal government has been able to provide tools to police services when and where they are needed. These measures have also provided police with the tools to address the financing of illegal activities. These measures have allowed municipalities to fill gaps in the acquisition of tow trucks to help in the removal of illegally parked vehicles. These measures have also helped to eliminate the blurring of jurisdiction and responsibilities at complex but important locations such as border crossings. I want to make it clear that while our government had to make this choice, it should not be seen as a celebration. But I feel much more at peace knowing that if the decision had to be made, at least many Many people have already gained some relief from it. We saw how Canadians reacted to the operations over the weekend in Ottawa. It's very clear to me that Canadians support the decision to invoke the Emergencies Act. To all of you who are listening, even if we do not all share the same values, we can empathize with each other. This pandemic has taken its toll on everyone, and we're all very keen for it to be over. Unfortunately, the events of the last few weeks were not the right way to end it. It has taken up valuable resources and time that were badly needed elsewhere in order to get through this pandemic. I will end with this, Madam Speaker. Some joined the convoy with the aim of promoting peace and freedom. Unfortunately, the target was not the right one, and their approach had the opposite effect. This convoy was unnecessary and a disturbance in the freest of countries, our Canada. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments, l'honorable député de Jonquière.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
The honourable member for Jonquière. A few times tonight, I've heard my colleague from Kingston, and now the colleague tonight said, well, maybe Ontario reacted perhaps not quite forcefully enough. And I feel like perhaps this is an excuse, but I would like to know, every time police forces act a little bit late, are they going to invoke the Emergencies Act? That would be completely absurd, because now we know the crisis is over, and the situation is quite a bit more acceptable. So why is it still relevant to bring forward this law, which is really a sledgehammer to crack a nut? So I'd like to hear what he has to say on that. Thank you. The honourable member for Acadie-Bathurst. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for the question. When it's time for the Bloc Québécois to stand and speak, they always talk about respecting Quebec and provincial jurisdiction. And so since the very beginning of this convoy, we've seen that, unfortunately, certain municipalities and police forces, for example, the City of Ottawa police forces, weren't capable of dealing with the situation. So that's why we went forward with the Emergencies Act. We provided resources that were necessary for the Ottawa police force and other police forces to dismantle this blockade, send the protesters home, and now Ottawa has its life back, because this convoy lasted for too long, 3 weeks, where there was all this noise, and so that's why we used it. The honourable member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Thank you, Madam Speaker. We know that the Emergencies Act is reasonable and proportionate, and it gives tools to parliamentarians to be able to use checks and balances. But the question that I want to put to my colleague is, why did it take so long for the government to act? Ottawa residents have suffered because of this. It was a convoy organized by far-right organizations to overthrow a democratically elected government, and funded by Trump-like organizations in the States. Why did it take 3 weeks? Once again, Madam Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague for the question. Madam Speaker, what we did is that we monitored the situation very closely, and after 3 weeks, after the protests had gone on and on, it was time for the government to intervene, and we gave the forces of law and order the tools that they needed to end this protest. And I might remind my colleague that under the Charter, this law is used with a great deal of restraint. It's time limited and geographically focused in the regions where it is needed. So, Madam Speaker, I think that people were tired of these protests, And we gave the forces of law and order all the tools they needed to end this protest. Thank you.
The honourable member for Brampton South.
Thank you, my honourable colleague, for the intervention, and I share members' passion, Madam Speaker. It's sad to see the spitting on police officer, harassing journalists by the protester. And Madam Speaker, I'm concerned about the spread of misinformation in journal and around the act as well. We have heard some of the protesters and even members of the opposition refer to the measures we are discussing today as if this is a War Measures Act, which it is not. Could my honourable colleague explain how this is not the case and assure them the Emergency Act maintain their charter rights and also restore their confidence in our institutions?
The honourable member for Akitsi Bathurst. I'd like to thank my colleague for the question, Madam Speaker, and I'm going to repeat once again to ensure that all Canadians hear this. Yes, the Charter will be complied with. The Emergencies Act will be used with a great deal of restraint. It will be time limited and geographically focused. And we must have to resume debate.
The honourable member for Langley-Aldergrove.
Good, thank you, Madam Speaker. We're here this evening, this whole weekend actually, debating the merits of a Liberal government motion to invoke the Emergency Act. But before I get into that, I want to take the opportunity to thank the many people in my riding of Langley-Aldergrove who've reached out to me to encourage me and to plead with me to vote against this motion. And I can assure you that I and my Conservative colleagues will definitely vote against it. And I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes or 9.5 minutes now explaining why that is. I also want to thank those people who were telling me that they are praying for the peace and security and the healing of this nation. Thank you very much. I'm praying for that as well, in what hopefully soon is going to be a post-pandemic world. So, Madam Speaker, on February 14th, the Liberal government issued a declaration invoking the Emergency Act based on their finding that there is a public welfare emergency existing in Canada at the moment. So to understand what that means, we need to take a look at the definition section of the Act, of the Emergency Act. And it states that a national emergency is an urgent and critical situation of a temporary nature that seriously endangers the lives, health, and safety of Canadians and is of such proportions and nature as to exceed the capacity or the authority of a province to deal with it, and that cannot be effectively dealt with under any other law of Canada. So very high burden of proof indeed, and that is exactly what the drafters of this legislation intended back in the 1980s. It was supposed to be a tool of last resort, not a tool of first resort. So now what is the fact situation that is alarming the government to the extent that they now feel that they have to invoke this very drastic step? Well, what we have is trucks parked in Ottawa, big trucks, rigs, clogging up the streets in downtown Ottawa. It's a real nuisance. Along Wellington Street, along some of the side streets. It's a real problem for local businesses here as well and people who live in the downtown core. I and every other member in this House who have to come into this House every day had to negotiate our way across Wellington Street, and that is the same for all the employees as well in this House and working in our parliamentary offices. A nuisance, yes. An inconvenience, yes. An irritant, yes. But a national emergency, no. It fails that test. This does not attain to the very high burden that I have to share my time with the member for Eagle Creek. So thank you. Carleton Trail, Eagle Creek. So thank you. But it does not attain to the very high level that was set by the drafters of this emergency legislation. Now, the Order in Council also makes reference. The Order in Council also makes reference to blockages at border crossings in Ontario, in Manitoba, in Alberta, and in my home province of British Columbia. Now, the Liberals there have a better argument, I would submit. because that, of course, is going to be very devastating to our economy and also to our international reputation. But here's the challenge that they have. Before this declaration was made, a week ago, all those blockages had already been cleared up. How? Well, by provincial forces, by municipal forces, by provincial police forces, by the RCMP that came under provincial jurisdiction. So the police forces doing exactly what they're supposed to do. And the fact that they were successful proved that the situation did not exceed the capacity or the authority of the province to deal with it. So I submit that it fails the test. So we come back to what was going on in Ottawa. Now we've heard members on the Liberal side of the House quote the interim chief of the City of Ottawa Police Services, saying that the Emergency Act was a very helpful tool for them to solve the problem. Now, we don't dispute that at all. Of course, the nuclear option is going to be successful. We know that. There's no argument with that. But that's not the test. The test is not whether it would be successful, but whether it was necessary. And I submit that it was not necessary. The proof is that provincial police forces, municipal police forces were able to solve the problem at the borders and also control other protests that were going on in other cities across the country. So it fails the threshold. Madam Speaker, I now want to turn my attention to a constitutional analysis of what is going on. It's been pointed out on a number of occasions that the Emergency Act requires that the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Canadian Bill of Rights be honored and respected and be maintained. Now, it's interesting that the Bill of Rights is included in that. It's an older piece of legislation, and people sometimes assume that it was subsumed in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but that's not the case. It is still good law in Canada today, and that is very useful for our analysis today because it talks about property rights for individuals. Now, what property are we talking about? We're talking about bank accounts that have been frozen under the regulations. Now, shortly after the announcement was made on Monday, my office started getting phone calls. I started getting text messages. People were saying, is my bank account going to be frozen? I made a donation to the convoy through GoFundMe. And I assured them, no, this is Canada in the 21st century. We are a modern, free, and democratic society. There is no way that your federal government is interested in donations that you might make to a cause that is important to you. But then, Madam Speaker, I actually picked up the regulation. I started to read it, and I was wrong. I was hoping that I was misreading it, so I checked with some lawyer friends of mine, and they go, no, absolutely, that is exactly what it says. So then I was hoping that maybe it was just a drafting error, but all doubt was set aside the other day when our Minister of Justice, the Attorney General, was interviewed on national television. And this is how the conversation went. The interviewer asked, a lot of folks said, I don't like your vaccine mandates, and I donated to this. Now it's illegal. Should I be worried that the bank can freeze my account? And this is what the Minister of Justice said in reply. If you are a member of a Trump movement who is donating hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars to this kind of thing, then yes, you ought to be worried. So there you go, straight out of the mouth of the Minister of Justice. If you have made a donation to the Freedom Convoy, then the Minister of Justice thinks that you are part of a Trump movement and that you ought to be worried. The Liberal Party is no longer the party of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It has become the party of correct political thought. You now have to think like the Minister of Justice does, or you ought to be worried. I plead with people of members of this House to vote against this motion. It is incumbent upon us to do this. This is wrong legislation. We must defend Canadian rights, civil liberties. We must vote against this. I plead with the NDP party. You could make the difference. Please vote with the Conservative Party on this one. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Madam Speaker, I really wanted to quote the Premier of Manitoba, but I kind of changed my mind based on what the member just finished saying about seniors. If you listen to some of the speeches from the Conservatives, One said, you know, they had a call for a senior that went down and took out all his money because they're told that the government wants to get its money. And you're starting to hear these conservative right-wingers with a conspiracy theory, you know, telling through email blasts, no doubt, that go and drain your bank accounts because the government's after your money. You know, we're talking less than 100 people that were directly affected in terms of accounts, yet the Conservative Party is going out warning people, our poor seniors, go out, be concerned, the government wants your money. I'm wondering if he feels that is a responsible thing for the official opposition to do, to get seniors and others concerned that the government is after their money when they know full well, Madam Speaker, that's not the case. I would suggest to you it's borderline elder abuse.
Honourable Member for Langley Aldergrove.
Well, Madam Speaker, that is just completely absurd. I'm quoting from what the minister said. Donating to the Freedom Convoy, to a Trump-like movement, you ought to be worried. Those are not my words. Those are his words. He should correct himself. If he misspoke, he should correct himself. He should also take a look at the legislation and correct it if there is a drafting error. I cannot believe, like you, that the Canadian government would take these kinds of actions, but that is what the wording of the legislation says. It needs to be corrected. Thank you.
Questions et commentaires, l'honorable député de Drummond.
The honourable member for Drummond. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech. Madam Speaker, we hear a lot of discussions on the Emergencies Act, that it's being debated, and I hope that there will be enough opposition to quash it tomorrow. My question for my colleague is, well, we hear a lot of criticism, and we hear a lot of different opinions on how this came to be. But according to my colleague, what would have been the ideal process to fix this crisis that that we've seen over the past 3 weeks? What would have been the proper procedure? Should we have left the protesters there, or should they have been invited to leave? What's his opinion on that?
Member for Langley Aldergrove.
Good, thank you. Great question. I really do appreciate that. What could have been done? Well, let's take a look at where it was done successfully in other provinces, in other cities. The problem is in Ottawa. Now, far be it from me to criticize the police forces of the nation's capital, but what could they have done? They could have subpoenaed tow trucks. They could have asked the provincial government for more help. They could have asked for police forces from across the country to come help. All of this could have been done without the Emergency Act, without suspending people's civil rights and liberties.
Honorable député de Rosemont-la-Petite.
The honourable member for Rosemont-la-Petite. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech. And just to clarify something with regard to, the Charter of Rights still applies, even when the Emergencies Act is in place. But I would like to know what his political party thinks about a convoy that comes from far away that says that it wants to disrupt our democratic institutions, that is funded by partisans of Trump, and the interim leader of his party openly supports these protesters and hands out coffee and pizza while those people are harassing the citizens of Ottawa. How does he explain the actions of some of the members of his caucus? The honourable member for Langley Aldergrove.
Thank you. I think there were two questions in there. The first one was about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Yes, indeed, the Emergency Act says that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Canadian Bill of Rights must still apply. But it's not good enough just to say that. The Order in Council, the regulations coming out of the Order in Council actually have to honour that, and I'm submitting that that did not happen. Thank you.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Carlton Trail, Eagle Creek.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. While it is a privilege to have the opportunity to rise and speak in this place to the motion put forward by the government, the absolute seriousness of these days and how we chart a path forward as a nation cannot be overstated. There is so much at stake. And I am grateful for the insightful interventions that have already been put forward by my caucus colleagues. From the outset, I want to assure my constituents, I have heard you, and I want you to know that I will be voting against this motion. I believe this action taken by the government is unnecessary, divisive, and a dramatic overreaction given the circumstances. At a time when provincial governments and other countries have ended COVID-19 restrictions or announced plans to end them, the Prime Minister is an exception to the trend and out of step. When Conservatives brought forward a reasonable motion calling on the federal government to table a plan outlining the steps and dates as to when federal COVID-19 mandates and restrictions would be rolled back, a plan that would reduce the temperature and address the concerns of Canadians across the entire country, the Prime Minister refused, and the Liberals, together with the NDP, defeated our motion. This crisis was entirely preventable and is the result of the Prime Minister's unwillingness to use common sense. Instead of taking actions to help lower the temperature, he insulted and disrespected Canadians. Instead of respecting Canadians, he doubled down on his efforts to wedge, divide, and stigmatize. Instead of apologizing and listening to what Canadians had to say, he jumped straight to the most extreme measures to deal with the protests and invoked the Emergencies Act. I want to thank the hundreds of constituents who emailed and called my office over the past week regarding the matter we are discussing here tonight. Less than 1% support the government's actions. Almost everyone is shocked and disappointed by the Prime Minister's invocation of the Emergencies Act. They understand that imposing the powers of the Emergencies Act sets a dangerous precedent, especially when the Prime Minister has made no other efforts to de-escalate the situation. I would like to read an email from a constituent, which is representative of the hundreds of messages I've received. Kathy wrote the following, and I quote, "I am emailing you in regards to the Prime Minister's irrational invoking of the Emergency Measures Act. I have read that the Emergencies Act can only be invoked if the situation cannot be dealt with through any other lawful manner in Canada. Considering the fact that the Prime Minister hasn't even sat down with the Freedom Convoy organizers to discuss removing all mandates, there is no need to invoke such an act. It has become very clear that the Prime Minister does not care about Canadians or our rights and freedoms. Many other countries have removed all mandates and restrictions and have come to realize that COVID has run its course. We need to get back to our lives and begin the massive job of rebuilding not only our economy, but mending all the division that the Prime Minister has created over the past 2 years. It breaks my heart to see all the families and friends that have been driven apart by this. As your constituent, I ask that when the Prime Minister goes before Parliament to seek approval of the Emergencies Act, that you do not approve this. Please help us in our fight to make Canada free again." End quote. Madam Speaker, to be clear, while I have heard from hundreds of my constituents, there have also been messages from hundreds of Canadians from across the country. They are worried about their future, for their children and their grandchildren. Ultimately, they are concerned for the future of their beloved Canada. Many legal experts also oppose this action, based on the grounds that the test for invoking the Emergencies Act has not been met. A Twitter thread on February 14th by the Canadian Civil Liberties Association was damning of the government's decision, and I quote, "The federal government has not met the threshold necessary to invoke the Emergencies Act. This law creates a high and clear standard for good reason. The Act allows government to bypass ordinary democratic processes. This standard has not been met. The Emergencies Act can only be invoked when a situation seriously threatens the ability of the Government of Canada to preserve the sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity, and when the situation cannot be effectively dealt with under any other law of Canada. Governments regularly deal with difficult situations and do so using powers granted to them by democratically elected representatives. Emergency legislation should not be normalized. It threatens our democracy and our civil liberties." End quote. Madam Speaker, many legal experts and organizations across Canada echo these concerns and believe that invoking this act is unnecessary and sets a dangerous precedent. Let's compare events in our not-so-distant past with the current situation. 2 years ago, there were a series of blockades on major rail lines and at the Port of Vancouver. From January to March of 2020, the protesters opposed to the Coastal GasLink pipeline and their supporters across Canada caused much economic hardship to the Canadian economy. What is strikingly different about that protest 2 years ago and the one we are experiencing today is not the response of law enforcement, but rather the response of the government. 2 years ago, ministers of the Crown met with the protesters, listened to their issues, and sought a peaceful resolution through dialogue. Granted, the police eventually moved in to clear the blockades, but it was obvious that all other avenues seeking a resolution had been exhausted. Did that happen this time? Certainly not. What have these protesters received from this government? Insults, divisiveness, and stigmatization. The Prime Minister's rhetoric during and since the election has poured fuel on the embers of distrust and division that were already smoldering. What we are seeing from this Prime Minister, his cabinet, and his backbench is shocking. Their willingness to exploit the pandemic and divide Canadians, together with their overreach, is driving the fear and concern for our future among my constituents and Canadians at large. This motion imposing the powers of the Emergencies Act will only exacerbate these feelings. Furthermore, the Government of Canada should not have the power to close the bank accounts of hardworking Canadians simply on the suspicion of supporting causes of which the government doesn't approve. This is a slippery slope and not how the government should operate in a free and democratic society. But perhaps that's the whole point of this exercise, given the Deputy Minister's comments yesterday when she stated, and I quote, "Some of those tools, we will be putting forward measures to put those tools permanently in place. The authorities of FinTrack, I believe, do need to be expanded to cover crowdsourcing platforms." Yeah, the minister used her inside voice and revealed the true Liberal agenda. Canada must not be defined by one government, any one parliament, or any one person, but rather by our shared values of freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. These values guide our institutions through which is realized peace, order, and good government. The pandemic has taken its toll on many of these institutions, largely due to the fact that in the beginning, there was so much confusion and uncertainty, planting the seeds of doubt and mistrust. But fast forward 2 years, where now the science and health experts are telling us we have come through the worst of it and that we need to reevaluate and get back to normal. Sadly, the Prime Minister's decision to invoke the Emergencies Act is another huge blow to the already crumbling trust many Canadians have in our institutions. Parliament has an opportunity to repair some of the damage and defeat this motion. Through you, Madam Speaker, I implore my colleagues to seize this opportunity and vote nay. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Vancouver Granville.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And we've heard a lot from the honourable member about common sense and doing what's best for Canadians. And I suppose, it'd be worth, I'd love to hear her comment on whether or not it was common sense for the interim leader of the Conservative Party to be photographed wearing MAGA hats and talking about making the convoy the Prime Minister's problem and saying that we should not be asking them to go home. So I wonder if she thinks that is common sense. Speaking of common sense, I will ask the same question I asked earlier. Given that she doesn't trust the government, would she trust the National Security Advisor to Conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper, who said that not only was it appropriate but necessary for the government to invoke the Emergencies Act, particularly as it relates to the very concerns around financing of this convoy that she seems to want us not to do?
Honourable Member for Carleton Trail Eagle Creek.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I thank my honourable colleague for his question. I think I made it pretty clear why I am deeply concerned about the measures that are in this Act that are going to seize and freeze the bank accounts of individuals that don't agree with the government. But to be equally clear, there is only one person that I believe bears the responsibility for what is happening in Ottawa, and that is the Prime Minister. What should we expect, though, when he calls those who don't agree with him misogynists, racists, science deniers, and wonders if such people should even be tolerated? Thank you.
L'honorable député de Jonquière.
The Honourable Member for Jonquière. Thank you, Madam Speaker. My colleague said that one person is responsible for what happened in the streets of Ottawa, and that is the Prime Minister. Now, I don't have any particular affection for the Prime Minister, but I would say that some Conservative colleagues have said some pretty dubious things about vaccination. Conservative colleagues also took photos with the demonstrators and encouraged them. So doesn't my colleague think that some of the responsibility ultimately comes back to her colleagues who were very complacent with the protesters?
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I thank my honourable colleague for the question. I would have to say that I believe that this is exactly what the Prime Minister would like parliamentarians to be doing here in this House, instead of focusing on the overreach of invoking the Emergencies Act. They want us to be arguing about whose fault it is that the protests lasted for as long as they did in the city of Ottawa. To be very clear, I firmly support the right to peaceful protest and the freedom of peaceful assembly. And I agree with the Premier of my province, who called on the people of Saskatchewan to exercise their rights without impeding on the rights of others. But I will reiterate that I believe there is only one person that bears the responsibility for what has happened.
The Honourable Member for Port Moody Coquitlam.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And the member was speaking about overreach and democracy. And I had a question to the member. The Conservative caucus twice has thrown out two leaders that were democratically elected by the delegates at their party conventions. Wondering if the member agrees with that overreach.
The Honourable Member for Carleton Trail Eagle Creek.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I thank my honourable colleague for her question, although I would tell her that I absolutely disagree with the premise of that question. Firstly, we had a leader that resigned back in 2019, and in this most recent case, we had adopted the Reform Act, which is a law of Parliament that provides members of Parliament with the tools that they need to hold their leader accountable. And so that is exactly what happened within the Conservative caucus. And I would say that, again, rather than discussing the overreach of this government and this Prime Minister to invoke the Emergencies Act to deal with something that could have been dealt with the law authorities in the city of Ottawa and in the province of Ontario, she's asking me about internal caucus issues.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Spadina, Fort York, but I have to tell the Honourable Member that there's about only 5 minutes left, and tomorrow morning at 7 the Honourable Member can pursue his speech and the period of questions.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm not pleased to be rising in the House tonight. The reason for my disappointment is due to a subject matter that I wish this House did not have to be debating. Nonetheless, tonight's debate is on a very serious subject, the implementation of the Emergencies Act. And I would like to believe that all honourable members of this place, irrespective of their political party, would also wish not to be here debating this subject. Unfortunately, Madam Speaker, we are. I believe that the events that have transpired at various Canadian border crossings and in our nation's capital over the last 3 weeks converge to provide few alternatives. Some may not see it that way, and I encourage them to take a hard, long second look. I appreciate that emotions remain high, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to do an objective, factual level set. And to do that, I want to take the location out of it, the city where the protest has been out of the debate. Put aside that it's been in Ottawa and ask yourself, if it was your city, your community, that had its main streets and downtown core barricaded by trucks and crowds. Imagine if it was your constituents and their neighborhoods effectively held hostage in their own city, their own community, and their own homes. Imagine if it was people from your community being harassed and intimidated, with some actually left fearing for their own personal safety. What about their rights to protection and their right to freedom of movement? Madam Speaker, in our community, Spadina, Fort York, we're no stranger to protests. Toronto City Hall is in our riding, and the provincial legislature, Queen's Park, is just outside of it. In fact, the route that people take to these places to exercise their democratic rights would literally mean often them driving by my home. And when they did, they'd often be honking. And my girlfriend and I would look out, see who they were, and even look up, see what it was that they were advocating for. But our rights to freedom of expression and assembly should not, must not, include the oppression of others. Madam Speaker, as a son of refugees, my family knew terror and injustice. They endured 2 years in a refugee camp to find a new home that shared their values, a place that valued democracy and rule of law. And I'm sad to say that I did not see that when I looked at the streets of Ottawa or the Ambassador Bridge. What we did see was our national monument to Canada's fallen disgraced, and the tomb of the unknown soldier being jumped on and urinated upon. And it's tragically ironic, Madam Speaker, that the soldier inside the tomb was once a person who knew well what fighting for freedom was all about. The same applies with the statue of a remarkable young man. Madam Speaker, Terry Fox raised more money than anyone in this country for those fighting an insidious disease and including those who are immunocompromised. The monument, the statue, these are precious symbols of the best of who we are as a country. That they were defiled is a disgrace, Madam Speaker. And some of the most impactful symbols are those of flags. Sadly, we saw protesters walking around with the flags of evil and racism. Even in the country where Nazism started, to parade around with that flag today gets you arrested. Then there was the Confederate flag, which some protesters chose to fly, a flag that continues to conjure up hatred and intolerance of a time when people were placed in chains and human slavery. My colleague, the honourable member from Hull-Eimer, eloquently recently reminded this House of what that flag represents. It doesn't mean freedom. It doesn't mean inclusion. It represents intolerance and human slavery. Flags matter, and symbols matter. Just like how our Canadian flag is a beacon of hope for so many people here at home and abroad. Madam Speaker, I was distraught. As a person who has also proudly worn the flag and the uniform of our country, to see people wrap themselves in our flag, to use it as a shield for their behavior that was often anything but honorable. Madam Speaker, What I've commented upon thus far is described in revolting detail, and I think lies at the heart, the very foundation of those who came to Ottawa. They did not come...
And I would interrupt the honourable member tomorrow to pursue. It being 11:59, pursuant to order made on Thursday, February 17, 2022, having reached the expiry of the time provided for today's debate, the House will resume consideration of the motion for confirmation at the next sitting of the House. En conséquence, la Chambre...
Accordingly, this House stands adjourned until tomorrow at 7 a.m., pursuant to order made on Thursday, February 17th, 2022.